After my husband died in a fiery crash, I sold my platinum wedding ring just to keep the lights on. I thought grief would be the heaviest burden I had to carry until a hidden note led me behind our heavy oak wardrobe. Do not trust what they told you, the handwriting said. In the cold dampness of our basement, my tears dried up and turned into a burning rage. The ashes on my mantle belonged to a stranger, and the box I opened revealed the most disgusting betrayal of my life. The cold fluorescent lights of the pawnshop buzzed overhead like a dying hornet. I stood at the scratched glass counter, my fingers trembling as I slid the platinum band across the worn velvet mat. The air inside the shop was thick with the smell of old brass dust and human desperation. I was 55 years old, standing in a rundown neighborhood, trading the symbol of my marriage for survival. The pawnbroker, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, picked up the ring. He wedged a jeweler's loop into his eye socket and turned the diamond under the harsh glare of his desk lamp. He did not ask about the man who gave it to me. He did not care about the promises made 30 years ago. He only cared about the clarity of the stone and the weight of the metal. "I will give you 2,000 for it," he said, his voice a flat, practiced drawl. My heart hammered against my ribs. $2,000. It was a fraction of what the ring was worth, but right now it was the only thing standing between me and total ruin. I nodded, unable to speak around the thick knot of humiliation lodged in my throat. As he counted out the crisp, indifferent bills, my mind drifted to the life I had surrendered for that ring. Years ago, I had a thriving career as a commercial real estate appraiser. I was sharp, respected, and making excellent money evaluating high-rise office buildings and sprawling retail centers. But when Robert's mother fell ill with severe dementia, the family needed help. Professional care was too expensive, and Robert pleaded with me to step in. I loved him, so I packed up my career and became a full-time caregiver. I spent my prime earning years bathing her, feeding her, and holding her hand until she passed away. When she was gone, I did not return to the real estate firm. Robert had just launched his import and export logistics company. He told me he needed someone he could trust completely to run the back office. So I became his unpaid accountant, his secretary, and his problem solver. I balanced the ledgers, managed the shipping manifests, and kept the business afloat while he played the charismatic frontman. I poured my sweat and my youth into his dream, trusting that his success was our success. Now all that sacrifice had been reduced to a stack of $100 bills sliding across a scratched glass counter. I took the cash, shoving it deep into my purse, and hurried out the door. The harsh, biting wind of the city hit my face the moment I stepped onto the pavement. I wrapped my wool coat tighter around my shoulders, keeping my head down as I walked toward my 10-year-old sedan parked at the end of the block. The $2,000 was barely a drop in the ocean of debt I supposedly owed, but it would at least pay the overdue utility bills and buy me a few more days of groceries. I reached for my car door handle, but a heavy hand slammed flat against the window, blocking my path. I gasped and stumbled backward. Standing between me and my car was my brother-in-law, Thomas Jenkins. Thomas was wearing a custom-tailored Italian wool suit that probably cost more than my car. His hair was slicked back perfectly, and the unmistakable cloying scent of expensive scotch, an arrogant entitlement, radiated from his pores. He looked down at me with a sickeningly sweet smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Selling off the family jewelry, Sarah?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock pity. I suppose desperate times call for desperate measures. I clutched my purse to my chest, forcing my eyes to fill with tears. I had to play the part of the broken, helpless widow. It was the only defense I had left. "Thomas, please, I am just trying to survive. The bank accounts are frozen and I do not have anything left." Thomas let out a heavy theatrical sigh and leaned against my car. He crossed his arms, looking at me as if I were a stray dog he was considering kicking. "You know I feel terrible for you, Sarah," he said, his tone slick and practiced. "Robert was my brother. Losing him in that horrific crash last week destroyed me too. When the police found his car burned to a crisp at the bottom of that ravine, a piece of my heart died. But grief does not pay the bills, Sarah. And Robert left behind a massive, catastrophic mess." I let a sob escape my lips, burying my face in my hands. The story of the crash had been repeating in my head like a nightmare for days. A blown tire, a steep drop, a fiery explosion that left nothing but dental records to identify my husband. That was what the authorities told me. That was what Thomas had confirmed. I know I wept, letting my shoulders shake. I know the logistics business was struggling, but I did not realize how bad it was. It was a bloodbath, Thomas said, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Robert hid it from you because he was ashamed, but the truth is, he racked up $3 million in corporate debt. 3 million, Sarah. He took out shadow loans, leveraged the shipping containers, and borrowed from some extremely dangerous people to keep the company afloat. When he died, those people came looking for their money. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with perfectly feigned terror. $3 million? How is that possible? What are we going to do? What I am going to do is save your life, Thomas said smoothly, though his eyes gleamed with raw malice. I stepped in. I liquidated some of my own assets and paid off the worst of the creditors. I kept the wolves away from your door, Sarah. I saved you from having your legs broken or worse. I covered Robert's mess because that is what family does. Oh, Thomas, thank you, I cried, reaching out to grasp his sleeve. Thank you so much. I do not know how I will ever repay you. He pulled his arm away gracefully, brushing off his sleeve, as if my touch had soiled the expensive fabric. That brings me to why I am here, he said, his voice hardening into steel. I covered the $3 million, but I am not a charity. I need to recoup my losses. Robert's business is bankrupt and the company accounts are drained. The only asset left of any real value is the house. My breath caught in my throat. The house. The beautiful 4-bedroom colonial that I had poured my heart into decorating. The house that was completely paid off thanks to my meticulous budgeting over the last 2 decades. I need you to sign this deed over to me, Thomas demanded, dropping the act of the grieving brother completely. I have the transfer paperwork ready. You need to sign it by this Friday. If you hand over the property, we will call it even. I will absorb the rest of the loss, and you can walk away clean. Walk away clean, I whimpered, letting fresh tears spill over my cheeks. Thomas, where will I go? I have no income. I have nothing. Please, I need more time. Give me a month to figure something out. You do not have a month, Sarah, he snapped, slamming his hand against the roof of my car. The loud crack made me flinch. I am being generous here. If you do not sign that deed by Friday, I will take my protection away. I will tell those ruthless creditors exactly where you live. They will take the house anyway, and they will not ask nicely. Do you understand me? Friday. Be at my office at noon. I nodded frantically, stepping back and curling into myself like a frightened child. I will be there, Thomas. I promise. Just please do not let them hurt me. Good girl, he sneered, clearly satisfied with my pathetic display of submission. He straightened his tie, shot me one last look of utter disgust, and walked away down the street toward his own luxury vehicle. I stood frozen by my old sedan, keeping my head bowed my shoulders, shaking violently. Anyone walking past would see a devastated, aging widow completely broken by grief and fear. But the moment Thomas turned a corner and disappeared from sight, my shaking stopped. I slowly raised my head. The tears on my cheeks were real, but the terror in my eyes had vanished entirely. In its place was a cold, sharp clarity that I had not felt in years. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, my breathing steadying into a calm, rhythmic pattern. The submissive, obedient wife who blindly trusted her husband's family was dead. The woman standing on the pavement was the senior commercial real estate appraiser. The woman who spent 10 years dissecting financial anomalies and finding the hidden truth in doctored ledgers. I reached into my purse, feeling the cold, hard cash I had just bled for, and stared at the empty street where Thomas had just been. $3 million in debt. The number echoed in my mind, but it did not bring fear. It brought extreme, calculating suspicion. I had run the back office of Robert's import and export company for years. I managed the accounts payable. I tracked the shipping manifests. I knew the profit margins on the overseas freight contracts. Yes, the business had taken a slight hit last quarter due to supply chain delays, but it was nowhere near a catastrophic failure. The company owned 5 cargo containers outright. The receivables from our European clients were solid. The operating costs were lean because I managed them myself. There was absolutely no mathematical possibility that Robert had accumulated $3 million in shadow loans without a massive gaping hole appearing in the cash flow ledgers I balanced every single month. Even if he had opened secret accounts, the operational volume of the business simply did not support that kind of rapid capital hemorrhage unless he was deliberately funneling the money out of the company. And then there was Thomas. Thomas who always complained about cash liquidity, Thomas who would never put his own lavish lifestyle at risk to save his brother's widow out of the goodness of his heart. Thomas was a vulture, a man who only swooped in when he smelled a guaranteed profit. If Thomas was so desperate to get his hands on the deed to my house, a house worth roughly $800,000 on the current market, it was not because he was trying to recoup a $3 million loss. A shark like Thomas does not settle for pennies on the dollar. He wanted the house because he needed me out of it. He needed me destitute, homeless, and too terrified to look closely at the paperwork. Thomas's math was sloppy. His lie was arrogant. He thought because I spent the last few years cooking dinners and caring for a sick old woman, my brain had turned to mush. He assumed I was just a domestic servant who would blindly accept any financial disaster he presented. He forgot who I used to be. I pulled my car keys from my pocket, the metal biting sharply into my palm. A fiery crash in a remote ravine. No witnesses. A body burned beyond recognition, identified only by dental records that Thomas had personally handed over to the coroner. $3 million in phantom debt. A sudden, aggressive demand to seize my only remaining asset. None of it added up. The neat, tragic story they had fed me was full of glaring structural cracks. I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat. The cold leather sent a jolt of energy up my spine. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. "I'm going to tear your sloppy numbers apart, Thomas," I whispered to the empty car. I started the engine. I did not know yet how deep the betrayal went, but I knew the grief that had anchored me to the floor for the past week was gone. It had been entirely replaced by a singular burning obsession to uncover the truth. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, heading back to the house Thomas was so desperate to take from me. I had until Friday to find the real ledger. I had until Friday to turn from the prey into the predator. The drive back to the house was a blur of grey skies and biting wind. I pulled into the driveway of the 4-bedroom colonial I had spent the last 2 decades turning into a home. The perfectly manicured lawn, the white trim I had painted myself, the heavy mahogany front door. It all felt like a stage set now, a theater where I had played the role of the dutiful, ignorant wife for far too long. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence of the house usually felt suffocating since the news of Robert's death, but today the silence felt different. It felt like a locked vault waiting to be cracked open. I walked straight past the living room, ignoring the polished silver urn resting on the fireplace mantel. The urn that supposedly held the ashes of my husband. I marched up the carpeted stairs, my steps heavy and deliberate. I entered the master bedroom. It was exactly as he had left it. His expensive cologne still hung faintly in the stale air. His tailored suits lined the walk-in closet. I grabbed a stack of cardboard boxes from the hallway and began aggressively pulling his clothes from the hangers. I was not packing out of grief anymore. I was packing to purge. When the closet was completely empty, I turned my attention to the far corner of the room. There it stood, the massive antique oak wardrobe. It was a heavy, imposing piece of furniture that Robert claimed was a precious heirloom from his grandfather. He was absolutely obsessed with it. For 15 years, he had explicitly forbidden me from touching it. He would snap at me if I even brought the vacuum cleaner too close, claiming the ancient wood was too fragile to withstand any accidental bumps. I always respected his wishes. I never questioned his sudden bursts of anger over a piece of wood. But right now, my mind was a high-speed processor connecting every anomaly. If Thomas was lying about the debt, what was Robert lying about all these years? I walked over to the wardrobe and pressed my hands flat against the carved oak doors. It was solid, heavy, and immovable, just like the lies I had been fed. I bent my knees, wedged my shoulder against the side panel, and pushed with every ounce of strength I had in my 55-year-old body. My boots slipped on the hardwood floor. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up my lower spine, and drove my weight forward. The wardrobe let out a loud, agonizing screech as the wooden legs scraped against the polished floorboards. I pushed again, gasping for air until I had moved it just enough to expose the dry wall behind it. Dust bunnies coated the floor thick and undisturbed for over a decade. I coughed, waving the dust away, and leaned into the narrow gap. The back of the wardrobe was unvarnished, rough wood, but right in the center at eye level, something white caught my attention. It was a small piece of heavy cardstock paper secured to the wood with a strip of clear packing tape. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. My fingers trembled as I reached into the gap and peeled the tape away. I pulled the paper out into the light. The handwriting was neat, sharp, and undeniably Robert's. The ink was stark against the white cardstock. I stared at the words, feeling a sudden chill seep into my bones. Do not trust what they told you. Look under the foundation. The foundation. The words echoed in my mind. The basement. Robert spent hours down in the unfinished section of our basement. He always claimed he was organizing old shipping manifests and tax records for the logistics company. He would lock the heavy metal door behind him, telling me the drafts ruined his concentration. I dropped the note on the bed and sprinted out of the bedroom. I ran down the stairs, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my chest. I flung open the door to the basement and descended the wooden steps. The air down here was cold, smelling of damp concrete, old cardboard, and secrets. I hit the light switch, flooding the space with harsh fluorescent glare. The unfinished side of the basement was a clutter of plastic storage bins and old holiday decorations. I pushed them aside recklessly, tossing boxes of ornaments and tangled lights out of my way. I fell to my knees on the cold concrete floor. Look under the foundation. The back corner of the room was slightly elevated, covered by a section of old wide plank pine boards that Robert had installed years ago, supposedly to keep the storage boxes off the damp concrete. I crawled over to the wooden platform. I pressed my ear against the boards and knocked on the wood with my knuckles. Solid, 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 hollow. I stopped. I knocked again on the board nearest to the concrete wall. A distinct hollow thud echoed back at me. I jumped up and ran to Robert's workbench. I grabbed a heavy iron crowbar, the cold metal grounding my frantic energy. I marched back to the wooden platform, wedged the curved end of the crowbar into the seam between the boards, and pulled down with all my might. The rusted nails shrieked as they were ripped from the wood. I threw my weight onto the crowbar, snapping the thick pine board completely in half. I tossed the broken wood aside and dropped to my knees. Beneath the floorboards was a rectangular cavity chiseled directly into the concrete foundation. Sitting inside that dark, dusty hole was a heavy fireproof steel lockbox. It was a commercial-grade safe, the kind used to store highly sensitive legal documents. I reached down and grabbed the metal handle. It was incredibly heavy, but a surge of pure adrenaline fueled my muscles. I hauled the lockbox out of the hole and dropped it onto the concrete floor with a loud clang. It had a digital keypad, but I did not have time to guess combinations. I grabbed the iron crowbar again. I raised it high above my head and brought it crashing down onto the digital lock. Plastic shattered and circuitry cracked. I swung the crowbar again and again, raining blows onto the locking mechanism until the steel latch warped and gave way. I tossed the crowbar aside my chest, heaving my hands coated in sweat and dust. I hooked my fingers under the heavy lid and wrenched it open. The inside of the box was lined with black velvet. Resting on top was a sleek black smartphone. A burner phone. Robert, the man who complained about upgrading his old cell phone because he hated learning new technology, had a hidden, untraceable device buried in our basement. I picked it up. The screen was dark, but it felt like a ticking time bomb in my hand. I set it carefully on the floor beside me. Beneath the phone was a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out and opened the metal clasp. I slid the contents onto the floor. It was a stack of bank statements printed on high-quality watermarked paper. My eyes, trained by a decade of analyzing commercial real estate ledgers, instantly recognized the formatting. It was a corporate account statement from a private wealth management bank located in the Cayman Islands. I scanned the account holder name, Horizon Global Ventures, LLC. I moved my finger across the columns of numbers, tracking the incoming wire transfers. 200,000, 500,000, 800,000. The deposits had been made systematically over the last 3 years. The funds were originating from a web of subsidiary accounts, slowly siphoning capital away from Robert's logistics firm. I flipped to the final page, my breath catching in my throat. The current available balance was circled in blue ink, $5,240,000. I sat back on my heels, the cold concrete biting into my knees. $5 million. Thomas had stood in front of me less than an hour ago, smelling of scotch and arrogance telling me my husband had died leaving a catastrophic $3 million debt. He told me I was ruined. He demanded the deed to my home to save me from ruthless creditors. But the debt was a lie. The financial ruin was a fabricated ghost story. Robert had not lost the company money. He had systematically stolen it. He had bled his own business dry, filtering the cash through shell companies and hiding it in an offshore account where I could never find it. But the betrayal did not stop there. I reached back into the lockbox and pulled out the final document. It was a thick packet of legal papers bound by a heavy black clip. I flipped open the cover page. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy issued by a top-tier commercial provider. The insured party was Robert Jenkins. The coverage amount was $5 million. I stared at the signature line on the bottom of the page. It was my signature, or rather, a flawless, masterful forgery of my signature. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never authorized a $5 million policy on my husband. I flipped to the beneficiary designation page. The payout was not directed to me, his legal wife. The primary beneficiary was listed as Apex Holdings, LLC, a corporate entity registered in Delaware. My mind raced assembling the puzzle pieces with terrifying speed. Apex Holdings, LLC. I knew exactly how corporate structures worked. Delaware LLCs provide absolute anonymity for their owners. Thomas loved using Delaware LLCs to hide his real estate acquisitions and dodge tax liabilities. Thomas was the shadow owner of Apex Holdings. The entire narrative crashed down on me, shattering the last remaining fragments of my grief. The fiery car crash in the remote ravine, the body burned beyond recognition, the dental records conveniently provided by Thomas to the county coroner, the offshore account holding $5 million, the forged life insurance policy set to pay out another $5 million directly to Thomas's untraceable shell company, the desperate sudden rush to seize the deed to my house and leave me with absolutely nothing on the street. Robert was not dead. I stared at the paperwork scattered across the dusty basement floor. The truth hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. My husband of 20 years had not perished in a tragic accident. He had staged his own death. He had spent years meticulously draining our corporate accounts, funneling the wealth we built together into a hidden offshore haven. He had colluded with his own brother Thomas to forge a massive life insurance policy. They burned a car in a ditch, provided fake dental records, and walked away with a fortune. Robert left me that note behind the wardrobe as a failsafe, a breadcrumb trail, just in case his brother decided to double-cross him. He knew I was the only one smart enough to decipher the financial trail if things went wrong. And the ashes. I looked up at the ceiling, picturing the polished silver urn sitting on the mantel in my living room. The urn I had wept over for 7 days. The urn I had spoken to in the dark, apologizing for not being a better wife, grieving the future we had lost together. The ashes inside that urn belonged to a stranger. Or perhaps they were just wood ash scooped from a fireplace. I had been weeping over a prop in a theater production designed by my own husband. My stomach violently churned. A wave of intense, blinding nausea washed over me. I pressed my hands flat against the cold concrete floor, taking deep, ragged breaths until the feeling finally passed. I did not cry. My eyes were completely dry. The woman who cried in the pawn shop was gone. The woman who begged Thomas for mercy in the street was dead. I looked at the offshore bank statements, the forged insurance policy, and the black burner phone resting in the dust. Robert thought I was a naive, obedient caregiver. He thought I had spent so much time washing his mother's sheets and balancing his petty cash drawer that I had forgotten how to read a complicated financial ledger. He thought I would quietly hand over my house to his brother and fade away into silent poverty. He forgot that before I was his devoted wife, I was a senior commercial appraiser. I spent my entire life dismantling financial lies, tracing hidden assets, and exposing hidden liabilities. I gathered the papers from the floor, my hands perfectly steady. The grief that had paralyzed me for a week was completely eradicated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute rage. Robert and Thomas had built a flawless illusion, but they had left the back door wide open. I stood up, holding the burner phone tightly in my fist. They wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life. I was going to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the woman who keeps the books. The cold concrete of the basement floor seeped into my knees, but I did not feel the chill. I sat in the harsh buzzing light of the overhead bulb, staring at the scattered contents of the fireproof lockbox. The offshore bank statements showing over $5 million, the forged life insurance policy, the heavy black burner phone resting silently in the dust. A few hours ago, I had been weeping in a pawn shop, trading my platinum wedding ring for $2,000 just to survive. I had believed I was a destitute widow left behind by a husband who died a tragic, fiery death. Now the absolute magnitude of the lie washed over me, stripping away every ounce of grief I had carried for the past 7 days. I raised my hand and wiped the last remaining tear from my cheek. The dampness on my skin felt entirely foreign. With a single deliberate breath, the terrified submissive caregiver ceased to exist. I let that weeping woman die right there in the dust. In her place, the senior commercial real estate appraiser woke up, my mind dulled by a decade of domestic routine, and pureeing soup for my sick mother-in-law suddenly snapped back into sharp, brilliant focus. Robert and his brother Thomas thought they had orchestrated the perfect crime. They assumed I was just a naive, aging housewife who would blindly sign over the deed to my home out of terror and fade into silent poverty. They forgot that for 20 years, my entire career was built on dismantling financial lies, tracing hidden assets, and finding the structural flaws in doctored corporate ledgers. I gathered the damning documents, placing them meticulously back into the steel box, and locked it securely in the trunk of my 10-year-old sedan. I was not going to confront Thomas with my findings. Confrontation was for amateurs. I needed hard, irrefutable digital leverage. If Thomas was operating a shadow shell company to launder the massive insurance payout, there had to be a trail on his personal servers. He was a deeply arrogant man, and arrogant men always underestimate their victims. I drove to a specialized electronics store on the industrial side of the city, a discreet place that sold security and surveillance equipment to private investigators. I walked in wearing dark sunglasses and a heavy wool coat, hunched over to look exactly like a paranoid, helpless older woman. I purchased a high-speed covert USB drive designed to automatically run a background extraction script the moment it was plugged into a computer port. It cost me nearly $400 from the cash I had bled for at the pawn shop, but it was an investment in my total survival. Next, I drove back to my empty house and booted up my old laptop. I needed to give Thomas exactly what he demanded, a deed to my home, but I needed to control the legal timeline. I spent an hour carefully drafting a quitclaim deed. Using my extensive appraisal background, I deliberately buried a tiny fatal flaw in the legal description of the property boundaries. I altered one digit in the meridian line, so coordinates, and slightly skewed the lot and block numbers. To the untrained eye of a greedy logistics broker, it looked like a standard legally binding transfer of assets. To a county clerk, it would be flagged and rejected immediately, tying up the transfer in bureaucratic red tape for at least 30 days. But Thomas would not scrutinize the fine print. He would see my signature on the bottom line, assume he had broken me completely, and drop his guard. I printed the flawed document, crumpled the edges slightly to make it look as though I had been clutching it in total despair, and walked into the bathroom to practice my performance in the mirror. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my shoulders slump forward, shrinking my posture to make myself look small, defeated, and utterly helpless. Society constantly underestimates women over 50, viewing us as invisible or easily manipulated. I was going to turn that invisibility into weaponized innocence. I was going to walk straight into the lion's den, and they would never see the predator hiding beneath the wool coat. The headquarters of Jenkins Logistics occupied the top floor of a sleek glass-fronted building in the financial district. I rode the elevator up, gripping my purse so tightly my knuckles turned white. The heavy steel door slid open to reveal a sprawling reception area decorated in dark mahogany and polished chrome. The receptionist, a young woman who had always treated me with thinly veiled condescension whenever I brought Robert his forgotten lunches, barely looked up from her glowing computer screen when I approached the desk. "I need to see Thomas," I whispered, making my voice tremble perfectly, pitching it an octave higher than usual. "Please tell him Sarah is here." She sighed loudly, clearly annoyed by my disheveled presence ruining the aesthetic of her lobby, and picked up her phone. A moment later, Thomas emerged from the heavy double doors of his corner executive office. He was wearing his suit jacket open, projecting the aura of a man who owned the entire city. When he saw me standing there looking pathetic, a cruel smirk twitched at the corner of his mouth before he quickly forced it down into a mask of grim manufactured sympathy. "Sarah," he said, his voice booming loud enough for the entire administrative floor to hear. "I am so glad you came to your senses. Come in, come in. Let us get this painful business over with." I followed him into his office. It smelled exactly like him, expensive leather, strong espresso, and unearned arrogance. He walked over to his massive desk and sat down in his high-backed leather chair, leaving me to stand awkwardly in the center of the room. His computer monitor was wide open, glowing brightly with complex spreadsheets and email clients. My appraiser's eyes locked onto the screen for a fraction of a second, mapping the position of the USB ports on the side of his tower, before I immediately lowered my gaze to the floor. "I brought the paperwork, Thomas," I said, pulling the deliberately flawed deed from my purse. I made sure my hands shook violently as I held it out to him. "I did exactly what you asked. Just please keep those debt collectors away from me. I cannot handle any more terror. I have not slept a wink since Robert died." Thomas leaned forward, snatching the paper directly from my trembling fingers. His eyes greedily scanned the page, skipping straight over the complicated property descriptions, just as I knew he would, and landed squarely on my forged signature at the bottom. A dark, triumphant gleam flashed across his face. He had won, or so he thought. "You did the right thing, Sarah," he said smoothly, sliding the deed into a sleek leather folder on his desk. "I know this feels like a terrible loss, but you have to look at the big picture. I am protecting you. Robert left you drowning in a sinking ship, and I am the only one throwing you a life preserver. You can stay in the house until the end of the month to pack your things. After that, I am putting it on the market to recoup the millions I lost, covering his shadow debts." I let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying my face in my hands. "I know, Thomas. I am just a foolish woman. I never understood the business. I just trusted Robert to take care of everything. Now I am a 55-year-old widow with nowhere to go." Thomas let out a dismissive chuckle, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "That is the tragedy of domestic life, Sarah. You spend 20 years baking casseroles and balancing checkbooks, and you completely forget how the real world operates. The real world is a bloodbath. Only the strong survive. You should be thanking me on your knees for stepping in to clean up this disaster before it swallowed you whole." I nodded frantically, wiping my fake tears. "I am thanking you, Thomas. I truly am." Suddenly, the sleek desk phone next to his monitor began to ring loudly. Thomas glanced at the caller ID, and his entire demeanor shifted. His posture stiffened, and his eyes darted toward me with sudden, intense urgency. "I need to take this," he said sharply, standing up and grabbing his cell phone from the desk. "It is an international call regarding a highly sensitive, delayed cargo freighter. Wait right here. Do not touch anything. I will be back in a moment to finalize the exit agreements." He did not even wait for my response. He turned and strode quickly out of the office, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind him. The loud click of the latch echoed in the sudden silence of the room. The moment the door closed, my hysterical sobbing ceased instantly. My spine snapped perfectly straight. The weeping, pathetic widow vanished into thin air, replaced by a surge of pure, freezing adrenaline. I had maybe 60 seconds, 2 minutes if the international call was complicated. I moved with a speed and precision I did not know I still possessed. I closed the distance to his executive desk in 3 silent strides. I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat and pulled out the covert USB drive. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my hands were completely steady. I leaned over his desk and slid the drive directly into the open port on the side of his computer tower. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second. A tiny, nearly invisible progress bar appeared in the bottom right corner of the monitor. The extraction script was running silently, pulling the cached local files, the browser history, and the downloaded wire transfer logs straight from his hard drive. I stood perfectly still, my eyes glued to the progress bar, counting the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the computer fan. I could hear the faint murmur of Thomas's voice echoing through the glass wall of the adjacent conference room. If he turned his head, if he looked through the horizontal blinds, he would see me leaning over his desk. I forced myself to breathe evenly. Panic causes mistakes, and I could not afford a single mistake. 40 seconds. The bar crept past the halfway point. I saw file names flashing rapidly across the background process window. Offshore routing numbers, Cayman Islands banking portals, cryptocurrency exchange receipts. Thomas was not just hiding the life insurance payout. He was running a massive illegal laundering operation right out of his logistics firm, and he was using Robert's fake death as the ultimate cover story. 50 seconds. The handle of the mahogany door suddenly jiggled. My breath caught in my throat. I yanked the USB drive out of the port and shoved it deep into my coat pocket. I threw myself back into the guest chair just as the heavy door swung wide open. I immediately buried my face in my hands, letting out a loud, shuddering wail of despair. Thomas marched back into the room looking visibly irritated by his phone call. He barely glanced at me as he walked back behind his desk and dropped his phone onto the polished wood. "International freight is a nightmare," he muttered, completely oblivious to the fact that his digital vault had just been picked clean. He looked down at me, his lip curling in utter disgust as I continued to rock back and forth in the chair, pretending to cry over my lost home. "Pull yourself together, Sarah," he snapped impatiently. "The paperwork is signed. The house is mine. I will have my assistant email you the timeline for vacating the premises. Now I have a massive company to run, and I cannot have you sitting in my office weeping all afternoon. It is terrible for morale." I sniffled loudly, wiping my nose with crumpled tissue. "I am sorry, Thomas. I will leave now. Thank you again for your mercy." He waved me off dismissively, already turning his attention back to his computer monitor. I stood up, keeping my shoulders slumped and my head bowed. I walked slowly out of the office, dragging my feet across the thick carpet to complete the illusion of a defeated, broken woman. I passed the receptionist, who rolled her eyes at my disheveled appearance, and stepped directly into the elevator. The heavy metal door slid shut, cutting me off from the Jenkins Logistics headquarters. As the elevator began its rapid descent to the ground floor, I reached into my coat pocket and closed my hand tightly around the small plastic USB drive. The cold, hard edges of the device pressed deeply into my palm, sending a thrilling jolt of absolute power straight to my core. Thomas thought he had just stolen my house. He thought he had effortlessly outsmarted a naive, grief-stricken housewife who knew nothing about the real world. He had no idea that I had just walked out of his office carrying the keys to his complete and total destruction. The game had shifted, and I was holding all the winning cards. I drove back to the empty colonial house with a singular burning focus. The fake tears from Thomas's office were completely dry upon my cheeks, leaving my skin tight and drawn. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door, stepped inside, and threw the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. I did not bother to take off my wool coat. I did not even turn on the main overhead lights in the hallway. The late afternoon shadows stretched long and gray across the marble countertops in the kitchen, creating the perfect isolated atmosphere for a digital excavation. I marched straight to the kitchen island, reaching deep into my coat pocket. I pulled out the heavy black burner phone I had dragged from the concrete tomb in the basement. It felt cold and incredibly dense in my palm. It was a solid brick of condensed lies. I held my breath and pressed the power button on the side of the device. For a terrifying moment, the screen remained completely black. I pressed the button harder, my fingernail digging into the cheap plastic casing. A faint white logo suddenly flickered to life in the center of the dark glass. The device vibrated once, a short, sharp buzz that sent a jolt of electricity straight up my arm. I waited in the quiet kitchen as the home screen loaded. There was no passcode requirement. Robert was far too arrogant to think anyone would ever find his secret lockbox hidden beneath the foundation of our home. He assumed his staged, fiery death would bury his secrets forever. The home screen was practically empty. There were no standard applications, no games, no weather widgets. There was only a single generic-looking blue icon sitting isolated in the center of the display. It was a secure, encrypted cloud chat application. I recognized the interface immediately. It was the exact kind of app favored by people who needed their digital footprints wiped clean on a daily basis. I tapped the blue icon with my index finger. The application opened instantly, completely bypassing any login screen. The user account was simply labeled with the initial R. There was only one active conversation thread sitting in the inbox. The contact name was saved as Ashley Brooks. I tapped on the thread, and a massive cascade of text messages flooded the screen. My eyes darted to the profile picture attached to the contact. It was a young woman no older than 28 wearing a tight high-end athletic top. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a flawless bouncy ponytail. She was posing in front of a mirror in what looked like an extremely expensive luxury fitness studio. A quick scan of the context clues in the messages confirmed her identity. Ashley Brooks was a high-end Pilates instructor operating out of a boutique studio downtown. It was the exact same studio where Robert miraculously began taking private rehabilitation sessions for his supposed chronic back pain a year ago. I began to scroll upward, reading through months of daily incessant conversations. The sheer volume of the messages made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to read every single word. The texts were not just romantic or illicit. They were dripping with a sickening, entitled arrogance. They traded photos of expensive steakhouse dinners, luxury ski resort brochures, and links to high-end winter gear. They were meticulously planning a lavish life built entirely on my financial ruin. I read a message from Ashley sent just 3 weeks ago. She was complaining bitterly about the delay in their timeline. "I am so tired of sneaking around Dora like this, Robert," she wrote. "When do we finally get to go to the cabin in Montana? I cannot wait to start our real life together, away from that dreary city and your depressing house. I need to know when the money is coming. And is that Mahosina?" Robert's reply made the blood freeze completely solid in my veins. He wrote back with a casual, devastating cruelty that completely erased 20 years of marriage. "Just be patient, baby," he typed. "Everything is almost in perfect place. The old appraiser is too dumb to check the LLC filings. She spends all her time baking casseroles and crying over my dead mother. Her brain turned to mush years ago. She will never look beneath the surface of the company debt. I just have to finish setting up the staged accident on the mountain road. Once the car goes over the ravine, I will hike out to the rendezvous point in the woods. Thomas will identify the fake dental records I bought. Once the $5 million life insurance pays out to Thomas's shell company, he wires us our cut, and we disappear to the cabin in Whitefish forever. She will just assume the logistics business went under, and she will quietly hand the house over to Thomas to cover the fake corporate debt. We will have $3 million in clean cash, and she will have nothing. I stared at the glowing screen, my vision tunneling, until all I could see were those vicious words. "The old appraiser is too dumb to check the LLC filings." The words echoed in my mind, ringing with a mocking crystal clarity. He thought my devotion to his family was sheer stupidity. He mistook my unwavering loyalty for blindness. He genuinely believed that the woman who used to spot microscopic financial discrepancies in multi-million-dollar commercial real estate appraisals had completely lost her mind just because she decided to be a supportive wife. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped my throat. The sound was harsh and entirely unfamiliar in the silent kitchen. Robert had traded a loyal, intelligent partner for a 28-year-old fitness instructor who cared more about designer winter sports gear than his actual personality. He had orchestrated his own fiery death, terrified me with fabricated corporate debt, and planned to leave me homeless in the dead of winter, also he could play out a pathetic midlife fantasy in a Montana cabin. But Robert had made a massive, fatal miscalculation. He had outsourced his financial getaway to his brother. I set the burner phone down on the cold marble countertop. The screen was still glowing with Ashley's sickeningly sweet replies praising Robert for being such a brilliant mastermind. My focus, however, had already shifted to the next critical layer of this miserable conspiracy. I reached into my other coat pocket and pulled out the covert USB drive I had just successfully smuggled out of Thomas's executive office. I retrieved my personal laptop from the dining room table, brought it into the kitchen, flipped the screen open, and plugged the small plastic drive into the side port. The data extraction script had worked flawlessly while Thomas was distracted by his phone call. A massive, heavily encrypted folder appeared immediately on my desktop. I cracked my knuckles, a familiar comforting gesture from my days working long nights at the commercial appraisal firm. The encryption Thomas used was basic. It was designed to keep out curious administrative assistants and casual snoops, not someone with a decade of high-level forensic accounting experience. Within 10 minutes, I easily bypassed the local password protection and opened the master directory. The folder was an absolute goldmine. It contained Thomas's private emails, his offshore routing ledgers, and the complete financial architecture of Apex Holdings, LLC. This was the exact shell company designated as the sole beneficiary of Robert's forged $5 million life insurance policy. I opened a massive spreadsheet labeled Q4 Offshore Distributions. My eyes scanned the dense columns of raw data, tracing the projected flow of the insurance money. According to Robert's text messages with his young mistress, the plan was incredibly simple. The life insurance company would disburse the $5 million to the Apex Holdings corporate account. Thomas, acting as the invisible managing member of the LLC, would take his $2 million cut for facilitating the massive fraud and supplying the fake dental records to the coroner. He would then wire the remaining $3 million to a hidden account accessible by Robert and Ashley. That money would fund their permanent, luxurious escape to the cabin in Whitefish. That was Robert's plan, but as my eyes tracked the destination routing numbers in Thomas's spreadsheet, a dark, immensely satisfying realization began to bloom deep inside my chest. I followed the digital trail from the Apex Holdings receiving account to the outbound distribution queue. I checked the routing numbers twice. I checked them a third time just to be absolutely certain. There was no $3 million wire scheduled for Robert. There was no secondary offshore account listed anywhere in the outbound transfer logs. Instead, Thomas had drafted a completely different financial protocol. The entire $5 million payout from the insurance company was scheduled to be immediately converted into untraceable cryptocurrency. Thomas was using a decentralized exchange based in Eastern Europe to wash the money. Once the funds were converted into crypto, they were programmed to be divided into dozens of anonymous digital wallets. I traced the ownership structure of those digital wallets using the IP addresses buried in Thomas's network logs. Every single wallet was controlled exclusively by Thomas. I scrolled through his private email outbox to verify my findings. I found a draft message saved just yesterday, addressed to an offshore crypto broker in Cyprus. The text was brutally clear and left no room for misinterpretation. Expedite the total conversion upon receipt of the $5 million, Thomas wrote. Wipe the receiving LLC entirely clean the moment the funds clear. Leave zero trace of the origin funds. Block all incoming communications from the Montana IP address. My appraiser brain clicked everything into perfect, horrifying alignment. Thomas had absolutely no intention of wiring his brother a single dime. Why would he? Robert was officially dead in the eyes of the law. Robert had zero legal standing, no valid identification, and absolutely no way to report a financial theft without exposing his own massive insurance fraud and going to federal prison. Robert had willingly handed his greedy brother the keys to a $5 million vault, assuming blood loyalty would keep him safe. But Thomas was a vulture. Thomas was going to take the entire $5 million payout, wash it through a crypto exchange so it could never be tracked, and vanish the funds completely. Thomas planned to leave his own brother completely stranded, totally penniless, and trapped as a dead fugitive hiding in the freezing mountains of Montana. And Thomas planned to steal my house on top of it all, leaving both me and Robert entirely ruined while he walked away with everything. I leaned back in the kitchen chair staring up at the ceiling. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was almost poetic in its cruelty. Robert had destroyed my life, faked his death, and broken my heart just to run away with a high-end fitness instructor, entirely confident in his flawless genius scheme. But Robert had trusted a starving shark to guard his fresh meat. Robert was currently sitting in a luxury cabin right now, drinking expensive champagne by a roaring fire, waiting for a $3 million wire transfer that was never ever going to arrive. He was a dead man walking. He was stripped of his identity, cut off from society, and about to be stripped of his entire fortune by the very brother he enlisted to help ruin his loyal wife. A slow, calculating smile spread across my face. It was the first genuine smile I had worn since the police knocked on my door to tell me my husband had burned alive in a tragic accident. Robert and Thomas had built a massive, intricate house of cards, but they had foolishly handed me the matches. I had the burner phone proving Robert was alive, documenting his intent to commit insurance fraud. I had the downloaded ledgers proving Thomas was embezzling the payout and laundering the funds through untraceable crypto wallets. I had the fake flawed deed I handed Thomas to keep him distracted, arrogant, and entirely focused in the wrong direction. They had both completely underestimated the quiet, grieving widow. They thought I was just collateral damage. They thought I would fade into the background, broken, destitute, and too busy weeping to look at the numbers. But the old appraiser was back. The woman who built their back office and balanced their books was wide awake. I was going to let Thomas finalize the insurance claim. I was going to let Robert wait in his freezing Montana cabin with his demanding young mistress watching his bank account remain at an absolute zero. And then, at the exact moment they realized their perfect crime had fallen completely apart, I was going to drop the hammer. I closed the laptop, the satisfying snap of the screen echoing sharply in the dark kitchen. I placed the burner phone next to the computer and smoothed the lapels of my wool coat. The mourning period for my husband was officially over. The execution phase had just begun. The morning air was bitter cold as I drove my old sedan through the affluent winding streets of Oak Brook. I had not slept a single minute. My mind was a relentless engine processing the massive betrayal I had uncovered in my basement. Robert was alive. Thomas was stealing his fake life insurance payout, and I was supposed to be left with absolutely nothing. But I knew I could not fight a multi-million-dollar fraud operation completely alone. I needed someone who understood the intricate legal loopholes Robert and Thomas exploited. I needed a shark who hated them just as much as I did. That is why I parked my car at the end of a long cobblestone driveway leading to a sprawling brick estate. This was the home of Gregory Hale. Gregory was a retired federal prosecutor, but before his prestigious career in the Justice Department, he had been Robert's founding business partner. 15 years ago, Gregory and Robert built the import and export logistics firm from the ground up. Gregory handled the legal compliance and the massive freight contracts. Robert handled the client relations. But when the company finally started generating millions in revenue, Robert and Thomas conspired to force Gregory out. They used a series of dirty corporate maneuvers, buried clauses, and threatened prolonged litigation to push him out of his own company for a fraction of what his shares were worth. Gregory never forgave them. He took his buyout, went back into federal law, and spent the next decade putting white-collar criminals in prison. I walked up the stone steps and rang the heavy brass doorbell. My heart was completely steady. Yesterday, I would have trembled at the thought of bothering a man like Gregory. Today, I was carrying the very weapon he had waited 15 years to use. The door opened to reveal a tall man in his early 60s. Gregory had sharp, perceptive eyes and a posture that commanded immediate respect. He was wearing a simple dark sweater and slacks holding a mug of black coffee. He looked at me, his brow furrowing in surprise. "Sarah," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. "I heard about Robert, the crash. I am sorry for your loss, but what are you doing here?" I did not offer him a polite smile. I looked him directly in the eyes. "I do not need your condolences, Gregory. My husband is not dead. He is sitting in a luxury cabin in Montana with a 28-year-old fitness instructor waiting for a $5 million life insurance payout that his brother Thomas is currently stealing from him." Gregory stared at me. The polite sympathy vanished from his face, instantly replaced by the cold, assessing stare of a veteran prosecutor. He stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing for me to enter his home. We walked into a massive study lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and dark leather furniture. The room smelled of old paper and wood polish. Gregory sat behind a heavy mahogany desk and motioned for me to take the chair opposite him. "You have exactly 5 minutes to convince me you have not lost your mind from grief, Sarah. Tell me what you found." I opened my purse and pulled out the thick manila envelope. I did not waste time with tears or emotional exposition. I laid the documents out on his desk like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a grand jury. I showed him the offshore bank statements from the Cayman Islands, showing the $5 million Robert had slowly drained from the company. I handed him the printed transcripts of the text messages between Robert and Ashley, detailing the staged car crash and the fake dental records. Finally, I placed the covert USB drive on the polished wood. I plugged this into Thomas's computer yesterday while I was weeping in his office playing the part of a devastated widow. It contains his private network logs and cryptocurrency conversion protocols. Thomas is listed as the shadow owner of Apex Holdings, LLC, the sole beneficiary of Robert's forged life insurance policy. Robert thinks Thomas is going to wire him $3 million to start a new life. But Thomas is actually washing the entire $5 million through a decentralized crypto exchange in Eastern Europe. He's going to leave Robert stranded and penniless, and he tried to extort my house from me to ensure I had no resources to fight back. Gregory picked up the text message transcripts. He read them in total silence. I watched his jaw clench. The anger radiating from him was palpable. For 15 years, he had known Robert and Thomas were deeply corrupt, but he never had the hard evidence to destroy them. Now the quiet wife they completely underestimated was handing him their entire criminal enterprise on a silver platter. I always knew Robert was a snake, Gregory said, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone. He smiled to your face while picking your pocket, but staging his own death to defraud a commercial insurance provider and Thomas double-crossing him for the payout. This is a level of arrogance I have not seen since my days prosecuting cartel accountants. He looked up from the papers, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. You took a massive risk stealing this data from Thomas Sarah. If he caught you, he would have destroyed you. I crossed my arms, feeling the absolute certainty in my chest. I spent 10 years working as a senior commercial real estate appraiser before Robert convinced me to stay home and care for his dying mother. I know how to read a ledger. I know how to spot a lie buried in a balance sheet. They thought my brain turned to mush just because I put on an apron. They forgot who I am. Now I want to tear their entire lives down, but I need your legal expertise to trigger the trap. A slow, predatory smile spread across Gregory's face. He picked up the covert USB drive and plugged it into his own encrypted laptop. Let us see exactly how greedy your brother-in-law really is. For the next 2 hours, we sat side by side at the heavy mahogany desk. It was an exhilarating alliance. My deep knowledge of Robert's back-office operations, combined with Gregory's relentless legal intuition, made us a formidable team. Gregory ran Thomas's files through a series of secure legal databases he still had access to from his prosecuting days. We traced the entire architecture of the $5 million life insurance policy. The policy was underwritten by a major national provider. The claim had already been filed by Thomas just 2 days after the supposed car crash. Because the coroner had officially certified the death based on the fake dental records Thomas supplied, the insurance company had initiated the mandatory processing period. Here is the vulnerability, Gregory said, pointing to a specific clause on his computer monitor. A $5 million payout does not clear overnight. It goes through an automated clearinghouse process, followed by a final review by the corporate fraud division. Thomas scheduled the final disbursement for next Tuesday. He's waiting for the funds to hit the Apex Holdings account so he can immediately execute his crypto wash. So how do we stop him? I asked, leaning closer to the screen. Gregory pulled up a blank legal document. We do not just stop him, we completely paralyze him. As the legal spouse, you have absolute standing to contest the disbursement of any major marital asset, especially a life insurance policy where your signature was forged to change the primary beneficiary. Gregory began typing rapidly, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced precision. We are going to file an emergency injunction for suspicion of fraud directly with the State Insurance Commission and the provider's legal department. You are going to state that you discovered profound financial anomalies in your husband's estate and that you suspect the beneficiary Apex Holdings is a fraudulent entity created to bypass spousal rights. I watched the legal document take shape. What happens when we file this injunction? The moment this document hits the desk of their corporate counsel, the entire $5 million will be frozen indefinitely, Gregory explained, a deep satisfaction echoing in his voice. They will flag the account. They will halt the wire transfer to Thomas immediately. A freeze like this triggers a mandatory federal review. They will scrutinize the LLC, uncover Thomas as the shadow owner, and demand a full investigation into the coroner's report. I felt a brilliant spark of pure triumph illuminate my mind. The beauty of the trap was absolute. If the money was frozen, Thomas could not complete his crypto laundering scheme. He would be sitting in his luxury office, staring at a pending transfer that would never arrive, completely unable to call the insurance company to complain, because complaining would invite a federal audit into his fake LLC. And Robert, I said, visualizing my treacherous husband sitting in his expensive winter gear. Robert will be sitting in that cabin in Montana. He will be waiting for Thomas to wire him the $3 million to start his new life with Ashley. But Thomas will not have the money to send. Exactly, Gregory said, hitting the print button on his laptop. Robert will think Thomas betrayed him early. Thomas will think the insurance company is just delaying the payout due to bureaucratic red tape. Neither of them will realize that the quiet, grieving widow they tried to destroy is the one who completely severed their financial lifeline. The printer hummed in the quiet study, spitting out the crisp white pages of the emergency injunction. Gregory gathered the papers, squared the edges on the desk, and slid a heavy silver pen across the wood toward me. I need your signature, Sarah. Once you sign this, there is no turning back. We are declaring open war on two highly desperate, highly dangerous men. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I picked up the silver pen. My hand was as steady as a surgeon's scalpel. I pressed the tip to the paper and signed my name with a sharp, aggressive stroke. I felt a tremendous weight lift from my shoulders. The years of silent domestic servitude, the quiet indignities, the ultimate betrayal of my marriage, all of it evaporated into thin air. I was taking my power back. Gregory took the signed document and placed it into a thick legal folder. I will file this personally with the State Commission before the end of the day. My old contacts in the fraud division will make sure this freeze is executed immediately. By tomorrow morning, that $5 million will be locked behind a federal wall that Thomas can never breach. I stood up from the desk, smoothing the fabric of my coat. The first layer of my revenge was officially in place. Thomas was legally paralyzed, but freezing the money was only half the battle. I needed to look Robert directly in the eyes when his entire fantasy world collapsed around him. I turned to Gregory. Thomas is handled. Now I need to find the exact location of that cabin in Montana. Gregory smiled, tapping the burner phone sitting on the desk. Your husband's new girlfriend is a 28-year-old fitness instructor who loves social media. People like her cannot resist taking photos of their luxurious lifestyle, even when they are supposed to be hiding. Gregory connected the burner phone to his computer. He opened the synced cloud chat application and pulled up the photos Ashley had sent Robert over the past 3 months. There were dozens of pictures of expensive ski gear, luxury watches, and first-class flight itineraries. Gregory downloaded the original image files and ran them through a basic metadata extraction tool. When you take a photo with a modern smartphone, it embeds hidden geographical coordinates directly into the file, Gregory explained, highlighting a string of numbers on the screen. Unless you actively turn off the location services, every single picture leaves a precise digital breadcrumb. He pasted the coordinates from a photo of a snowy mountain view into a satellite mapping program. The screen zoomed in rapidly, crossing the country, flying over the Rocky Mountains, and stopping on an isolated, sprawling timber cabin located deep in the woods of Whitefish, Montana. The address appeared clearly on the screen. I stared at the location. My heart was cold and methodical. Robert was sitting in that cabin right now, drinking champagne, celebrating my absolute ruin. He believed I was back in Chicago, weeping in an empty house, preparing to hand the deed over to his brother. I am going to Montana, I said, my voice echoing with pure, unadulterated boss energy. I am going to walk through the front door of that cabin and watch him realize that he's a dead man walking with an empty bank account. Gregory stood up, holding the folder with the injunction. I will handle the legal destruction here in Chicago. When you confront him, do not let him negotiate. Break his spirit completely. I will not leave a single piece of his pride intact, I replied. I walked out of Gregory's estate and stepped back into the freezing winter air. The sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the remaining snow on the ground. I felt completely reborn. I opened the door of my car and climbed inside. I pulled out my phone and booked a one-way ticket to Kalispell International Airport. The flight left first thing the next morning. The grieving widow routine was officially retired. It was time to go hunting. I sat in my car for a few moments longer, mentally reviewing the timeline. I had to ensure the trap was perfectly synchronized. While I was in the air flying toward Montana, the insurance company would process Gregory's injunction. By the time I touched down and secured a rental vehicle to drive up the mountain, Thomas would be checking his bank accounts, desperately waiting for a massive cash deposit that would never arrive. His crypto broker in Cyprus would be demanding the funds. Thomas would panic. He would try to reach out to the insurance executives, only to be met with a wall of silence from federal compliance officers. The walls would start closing in on him from every side, and he would have absolutely no idea that his quiet sister-in-law had orchestrated the entire blockade. Meanwhile, Robert would be isolated in the snowy wilderness. He would be checking his encrypted burner phone, waiting for his brother to confirm the successful transfer of $3 million. The silence would slowly drive him insane. The paranoia would begin to rot their perfect plan from the inside out. Ashley, who was only interested in the money and the luxury lifestyle, would quickly lose her patience. The romantic getaway would turn into a pressure cooker of anxiety and mutual suspicion. And right at the peak of their terror, when they realized they were completely cut off from the world with zero resources, I would arrive. I started the engine of my sedan. The sound of the motor roared to life, matching the fierce, relentless energy coursing through my veins. I drove back toward the city, my mind perfectly calm. I had spent years analyzing the structural integrity of massive concrete buildings, looking for hidden flaws and microscopic cracks in the foundation. Now I was applying those exact same skills to demolish the lives of the two men who had tried to destroy me. The drive home felt incredibly short. I walked into my house and immediately began packing a small dark suitcase. I packed thick winter boots, a heavy thermal coat, and a pair of leather gloves. I was not packing to go on a vacation. I was packing for an execution. The ashes in the silver urn on the mantel seemed to mock me as I passed through the living room, but I ignored them. I knew the real Robert was waiting for me in Whitefish, and I was going to deliver a reckoning that he would never ever forget. Gregory printed the emergency injunction to freeze the $5 million life insurance policy. But my mind was already racing toward the next vulnerability in their elaborate scheme. Freezing the payout would definitely throw my brother-in-law into an absolute panic, but I wanted a permanent solution. Thomas had stood in the freezing street and demanded the deed to my home. I had handed him a deliberately flawed quitclaim document, buying myself 30 days of bureaucratic delay. But delay was simply not enough. I needed Thomas to walk into a federal trap the exact moment he tried to record that document. I looked across the heavy mahogany desk at Gregory. I told him we were not finished. Freezing the insurance money was a fantastic start, but I wanted Thomas facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary when the dust finally settled. I explained my strategy, tapping my fingers on the polished wood of his desk. I spent over a decade working as a senior commercial real estate appraiser. I knew property law just as well as I knew financial ledgers. We were going to file a quiet title action on my property immediately. I explained to Gregory that a quiet title action is a specific lawsuit that establishes a party's title to real property against anyone and everyone, effectively cutting off any future claims or disputes. By filing this action first, the county clerk would be legally obligated to place a strict flag on my property profile. When Thomas marched down to the county records office to file the quitclaim deed he had brutally extorted from me, he would instantly trigger that legal flag. Because he had used the explicit threat of debt collection to force me to sign it, and because we had the stolen ledgers proving that the $3 million corporate debt was a complete and total fabrication. His act of filing the deed would officially constitute felony extortion and wire fraud. He would be using false pretenses to seize a major asset. Gregory let out a low, deeply impressed chuckle. He opened a new window on his encrypted laptop and immediately began drafting the legal petition. As a retired federal prosecutor, he knew exactly how to phrase the complaint to catch the immediate attention of the district attorney. We attached the downloaded ledgers from Thomas's computer, definitively proving that the debt was a ghost story invented to terrify a grieving widow. We documented the precise timeline of his threats. By the time Gregory hit submit on the electronic filing portal, the steel jaws of the trap had snapped entirely shut. If Thomas took a single step toward claiming my house, he would be walking straight into a devastating federal indictment. He thought he was seizing an $800,000 property from a helpless woman. Instead, he was sealing his own fate. With Thomas legally paralyzed and the insurance payout securely frozen behind a federal compliance wall, I turned my attention back to the true architect of this absolute nightmare. Robert, my supposedly dead husband, was waiting for his massive payday. He was out there in the world right now, breathing, laughing, and celebrating my total destruction. I picked up the black burner phone from Gregory's desk. The screen was still unlocked, displaying the synced cloud chat application. Ashley Brooks, the 28-year-old high-end fitness instructor who had helped him destroy my 20-year marriage, had been incredibly careless. Arrogant people are always careless. They believe they are entirely untouchable, which makes them incredibly sloppy with their digital footprints. I sat back in the heavy leather guest chair and began scrolling through her extensive photo gallery again. I had already seen the sickening pictures of expensive champagne bottles, luxury ski gear, and roaring fireplaces, but I needed a precise, undeniable location. I needed a physical address. Gregory had mentioned metadata earlier, but I did not even need his federal extraction tools. I knew how to look for the tiny, insignificant details that greedy people always overlook. I tapped on a high-resolution photo of Ashley standing on a wide wooden deck. She was wrapped in a thick fur blanket, holding a steaming ceramic mug, smiling brightly for the camera. The background was a breathtaking view of snow-capped mountains and towering pine trees. But I was not looking at the gorgeous scenery. I was looking closely at the reflection in the large sliding glass door behind her. I zoomed in on the glass, my eyes narrowing. The reflection clearly showed a narrow, unpaved driveway and a distinctive wooden signpost planted at the edge of the property line. The image was reversed, but my brain quickly decoded the carved letters. Whisper Creek Lodge. Below the name was a small 5-digit property parcel number. That was absolutely all the information a seasoned commercial real estate appraiser needed. I pulled my personal laptop toward me and quickly accessed the county assessor database for the region Gregory had identified earlier through the digital coordinates. Whitefish, Montana. The perfect place for a wealthy man to disappear into the wilderness. I typed the 5-digit parcel number directly into the public property records search bar. The system churned for a few seconds before generating a massive detailed file. The property was a secluded, high-end luxury cabin located 15 miles outside the main town center of Whitefish. It sat on 20 acres of private, heavily wooded land. It featured heated floors, a wraparound deck, and a private access road. It was exactly the kind of place a man would choose if he wanted to disappear completely while still enjoying the lavish, entitled lifestyle he craved. I pulled up the ownership history and the most recent transfer deeds. The property had been purchased in cash exactly 4 months ago. The recorded owner was a newly formed private trust. The designated trustee was listed clearly as Ashley Brooks. A wave of profound, sickening clarity washed over me. Robert had planned this betrayal meticulously. He had used Ashley as the clean face for the real estate transaction to ensure his own name was completely removed from the paper trail, long before he ever staged his death. He had funneled the stolen company funds through her personal accounts to secure their perfect mountain hideaway, leaving me back in Chicago to cook his meals, wash his clothes, and absorb the crushing weight of his fabricated corporate debt. He was probably sitting in that beautiful cabin right now, looking out at those snow-covered mountains, completely confident that he had won the ultimate prize. He believed I was a broken, weeping woman who was too busy grieving his tragic death to ever suspect a thing. He thought he had buried me alive in a mountain of fake debt and despair. He thought I was just a naive caregiver whose brain had softened after years of domestic servitude. He had no idea that the woman he left behind had just burned his entire operation to the ground. I closed the property records tab and opened an airline booking portal. I typed in Kalispell, Montana, which was the closest regional airport to the town of Whitefish. There was a flight leaving Chicago O'Hare at 6 o'clock the next morning. I selected a single one-way ticket. I did not need a return flight right now. I did not know exactly how long it would take to completely dismantle his life, but I knew I was not coming back until the job was entirely finished. I entered my credit card information and finalized the purchase. The confirmation email appeared in my inbox, instantly serving as a digital receipt for my vengeance. I looked across the desk at Gregory. He was watching me with a look of profound, silent respect. He had seen me walk into his home earlier that morning as a desperate, terrified widow, and he was watching me leave as a completely different woman. I thanked him for his incredible help. I told him to watch the financial monitors carefully because tomorrow the shockwaves of our legal trap were going to hit Thomas with the destructive force of a freight train. Gregory smiled a cold, hard smile. He promised to handle the absolute fallout in Chicago. He promised to make sure Thomas felt every single ounce of the legal terror we had just unleashed. I gathered my things, put the black burner phone into my heavy coat pocket, and walked out of the sprawling brick estate. The freezing winter air hit my face the moment I stepped outside, but I did not feel the cold at all. I only felt the burning, relentless drive of a woman who was fully prepared to bring a dead man back to life just so she could destroy him all over again. I started the engine of my car, my mind perfectly calm and fiercely focused. The grieving widow routine was officially over. It was time to go hunting in the snow. The flight from Chicago to Kalispell International Airport was a turbulent journey through thick gray winter clouds. I sat by the window seat and stared out at the frozen landscape far below. My mind was completely empty of fear. The woman who would have been terrified of flying alone to a remote mountain estate was gone. The plane touched down heavily on the tarmac, and the jolt sent a vibration up my spine. I gathered my small bag and walked out of the terminal. The moment the automatic doors slid open, the brutal Montana winter hit me like a physical blow. The air was incredibly thin and so freezing cold that my first breath burned the inside of my lungs. The temperature was well below zero, and the biting wind whipped snow across the parking lot in frantic swirling patterns. I pulled my heavy thermal coat tighter around my shoulders. The freezing wind numbed my cheeks, but the bitter cold could not touch the absolute burning rage radiating from the center of my chest. It was a strange contradiction. My body was shivering from the Arctic temperature, but my blood felt like liquid fire. I was a 55-year-old woman standing alone in a frozen wasteland, and I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. I walked to the rental car counter with a steady and purposeful stride. I did not look like a grieving widow anymore. I looked like a woman on a very specific mission. I approached the agent and requested the heaviest four-wheel drive sport utility vehicle they had on the lot. I needed a machine that could handle treacherous mountain roads and deep snowdrifts. The agent handed me the keys to a massive black truck. I walked out to the designated parking space and climbed into the driver's seat. The interior of the car smelled of synthetic leather and chemical pine freshener. I started the engine and turned the heating system up to the maximum level. I sat there for a moment and let the warm air blast against my freezing hands. I pulled the black burner phone from my pocket and checked the digital coordinates Gregory had extracted. Whisper Creek Lodge was located high up in the mountains, roughly 15 miles outside the main town center. I memorized the route perfectly. I shifted the heavy vehicle into gear and drove out of the airport lot, heading straight toward the towering snow-capped peaks looming in the distance. The transition from the paved highways of the flatlands to the winding mountain roads was abrupt and terrifying. The town of Kalispell quickly faded behind me, replaced by an endless expanse of towering evergreen trees heavily laden with fresh snow. The sky above was a pale bruised gray, casting long eerie shadows across the wilderness. The road narrowed significantly as I drove higher up the mountain. The pavement was covered in a thick layer of packed ice and loose snow. The heavy tires of the truck crunched and slipped against the slick surface, but I kept my hands locked on the steering wheel. I steered the vehicle with a cold, calculated precision. The isolation of the environment was absolute. There were no other cars on the road. There were no streetlights to pierce the gathering gloom of the late afternoon. The cell service indicator on my dashboard dropped to zero, leaving me completely disconnected from the rest of the world. It was the perfect place for a wealthy man to hide a stolen fortune. It was the perfect place to bury a secret. I navigated a series of steep switchbacks and blind curves, relying entirely on the detailed map I had memorized. My mind was running through the financial ledgers and the forged insurance policies. I thought about Thomas sitting in his glass office in Chicago, waiting for the $5 million wire transfer to clear. I thought about the federal injunction Gregory had filed, freezing the entire payout in a bureaucratic vault. The trap was already closing around them, but they were completely oblivious. I drove for another 30 minutes, climbing higher into the freezing wilderness, until I finally saw the small wooden signpost Gregory had spotted in the background of Ashley's photograph. The sign read, Whisper Creek Lodge, in elegant carved letters. A narrow, unpaved driveway branched off from the main road, winding deep into the dense pine forest. I did not turn down the driveway. I knew the sound of the heavy engine and the sweep of the headlights would instantly alert anyone inside the cabin. I drove past the entrance for about a quarter of a mile until I found a small clearing tucked behind a thick grove of trees. I pulled the heavy truck off the road and parked it deep in the shadows where it would be completely hidden from view. I turned off the engine, and the sudden silence of the mountain descended upon me like a heavy blanket. I sat in the silent darkness of the vehicle and prepared myself for the final approach. I put on my thick leather gloves and adjusted the collar of my thermal coat. I opened the door and stepped out into the knee-deep snow. The freezing cold immediately soaked through the fabric of my trousers, but I ignored the biting discomfort. I closed the car door quietly, making sure not to slam the heavy metal. I turned and began to trudge back toward the private driveway. The physical toll of walking through the deep, unpacked snow was immense. Every step required a massive amount of effort. My boots sank deep into the white powder, and my lungs burned as I gasped for the thin, icy air. I was not a young woman, and I had not exercised in years. My body had been conditioned by decades of sitting at an appraisal desk and standing over a hot stove, preparing meals for a husband who was secretly plotting my destruction. But the burning fury in my chest pushed me forward. The anger fueled my muscles, giving me a terrifying, unnatural strength. I walked along the edge of the tree line, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the towering pines. The wind howled through the branches above me, masking the loud crunch of my boots breaking through the icy crust of the snow. I moved with a slow, deliberate stealth, treating the forest like a hostile environment. I was a predator, tracking my prey through the wilderness. I finally reached the edge of the private driveway and began to follow it up the slope. The trees grew thicker, and the shadows deepened as the last remnants of daylight faded from the bruised gray sky. I walked for 10 agonizing minutes, fighting through the freezing wind and the biting cold until the trees suddenly parted to reveal a massive clearing. I stopped instantly and pressed my back against the rough bark of a massive pine tree. I held my breath and stared at the structure rising from the snow. Whisper Creek Lodge was a stunning masterpiece of modern architectural design. My appraiser brain immediately calculated the value of the materials and the construction costs. It was a sprawling 2-story timber and glass structure built directly into the side of the mountain. The exterior was crafted from dark treated wood and heavy stone. The roof was covered in a thick blanket of pristine white snow, but the most striking feature of the cabin was the massive wall of floor-to-ceiling glass windows that made up the entire rear facade of the building. The glass wall provided a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the mountain valley below. It also provided me with a perfect, unobstructed view of the interior. The cabin was glowing brightly against the dark winter landscape. Warm yellow light spilled out from the windows, illuminating the snow-covered deck and the surrounding trees. I crept closer to the edge of the tree line, staying completely hidden in the deep shadows. I stopped about 50 feet away from the glass wall and stared into the brightly lit living room. The breath caught violently in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs with a frantic, deafening rhythm. Standing right there in the center of the luxurious living room was my husband. Robert was alive. He was not a charred corpse buried in a tragic, fiery wreck. He was standing in front of a massive stone fireplace, wearing an expensive cashmere sweater and tailored dark slacks. He looked incredibly healthy and entirely relaxed. There was no chronic back pain. There was no sign of the tremendous stress he always claimed to carry from running a failing logistics business. He was smiling a bright, carefree smile that I had not seen directed at me in over a decade. He was holding a crystal flute filled with bubbling golden champagne. The sheer audacity of his existence hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I pressed my gloved hand against the rough bark of the pine tree to keep myself from collapsing into the snow. I had mourned this man. I had wept until I could not breathe. I had traded my platinum wedding ring for cash to survive the crushing debt he had fabricated to ruin me. And here he was standing in a multi-million-dollar mountain hideaway, drinking expensive champagne. A moment later, a young woman walked into my field of vision. It was Ashley Brooks. She looked exactly like the photograph I had found on the hidden burner phone. She was tall and athletic, with long blonde hair cascading down her back. She was wearing a sleek, form-fitting winter outfit that probably cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget. She walked up to Robert and wrapped her arms around his waist, leaning her head against his shoulder. Robert turned and kissed her forehead, wrapping his free arm around her shoulders. They stood there together, looking into the roaring fire, the absolute picture of a happy, wealthy couple celebrating their perfect, successful crime. They were celebrating my complete and total destruction. They were waiting for Thomas to wire them $3 million so they could spend the rest of their lives skiing and drinking champagne while I froze on the streets of Chicago. I stood in the freezing snow and watched them. The biting wind whipped my hair across my face and numbed my skin, but the fire inside me was burning hotter than the flames in their luxurious stone hearth. I watched Robert laugh at something Ashley said. I watched him raise his champagne glass in a mocking toast to the life he had left behind. Every single trace of the woman who used to love him burned away into ash. The submissive wife, the diligent caretaker, the grieving widow, they were all completely gone. Only the cold, calculating appraiser remained. I observed the layout of the cabin, noting the exits, the security features, and the structural vulnerabilities. They thought they were perfectly safe in their isolated mountain fortress. They thought their money was secured and their future was guaranteed. They had absolutely no idea that the very woman they had discarded was standing right outside their window, holding the match that would burn their entire fantasy world to the ground. I stepped back deeper into the shadows of the tree line, my eyes locked on the glowing glass wall. The trap was set, and the prey was completely oblivious. I stepped out of the protective darkness of the tree line and walked deliberately toward the massive wooden deck of the cabin. The snow crunched loudly beneath my heavy winter boots, but the howling Montana wind swallowed the sound completely. I climbed the thick wooden steps. Every step felt like a shedding of my old life. The submissive wife who worried about Robert's cholesterol, who kept his shirts perfectly pressed, who wept over an empty silver urn, she was dead. I reached the landing. The front door was a heavy slab of solid oak with a frosted glass panel in the center. I did not bother to knock. I did not want to give them a single second to prepare their lies or put on their masks. I planted my left foot firmly on the icy wooden plank, raised my right leg, and kicked the area right next to the deadbolt with every single ounce of strength I had in my body. The wood splintered with a deafening, violent crack. The heavy metal strike plate tore through the doorframe, and the massive oak door flew inward, crashing hard against the interior wall of the cabin. The sudden explosive noise ripped through the peaceful luxury of their mountain hideout. I stepped over the threshold, bringing the bitter, freezing mountain wind inside with me. The contrast between the biting cold air at my back and the suffocating heat of their roaring stone fireplace was instantly overwhelming. I stood in the entryway, my heavy thermal coat dusted with fresh snow, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I looked directly into the center of the living room. Robert was standing frozen exactly where I had seen him through the glass wall. His face, which had been glowing with carefree triumph just seconds ago, was now completely drained of color. He looked like a man who had just been forcefully dragged to the edge of an open grave. His jaw hung slack. His eyes were wide with a terror so absolute it bordered on madness. He was staring at me as if I were a vengeful ghost clawing her way out of the underworld. The crystal flute in his hand slipped from his numb fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces. The expensive golden champagne splashed across the expensive rugs, completely ignored. The silence in the room was heavier than the winter storm outside. Neither Robert nor his 28-year-old mistress moved a single muscle. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of my presence. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not demand to know how he could do this to me. Emotional outbursts are for victims, and I was no longer a victim. I was the executioner. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, the snow falling from my boots and melting instantly on the heated floorboards. I walked into the grand living room, my eyes sweeping over the vaulted ceilings, the expensive leather furniture, and the massive stone hearth. It was a beautiful cage they had built for themselves. I stopped right in front of the heavy mahogany coffee table that separated us. Robert tried to speak. His mouth opened and closed twice, but his vocal cords completely failed him. A pathetic, strangled wheeze was the only sound that managed to escape his throat. I pulled my hand out of my heavy coat pocket. I was holding a thick black leather folder. I raised my arm and dropped the folder directly onto the center of the mahogany coffee table. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the quiet cabin, breaking the spell of their paralysis. I reached forward and slowly flipped the folder open. I wanted him to see exactly how thoroughly I had dismantled his genius plan. I spread the documents out across the polished wood, arranging them with the precise, methodical care of a senior commercial appraiser presenting a finalized audit. The first document was the printed ledger from his hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The second was a high-resolution copy of the forged life insurance policy bearing my fake signature. The third was the fake death certificate signed by the corrupt county coroner, and sitting right on top of it all was a printout of the emergency federal injunction Gregory and I had filed, effectively freezing the entire $5 million payout. Robert stared at the papers. His eyes darted frantically from the bank statements to the injunction, his brain desperately trying to process the magnitude of the disaster laid out before him. I looked at him feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical satisfaction. "You left a note behind the antique oak wardrobe, Robert," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any anger or sorrow. It was the calm, steady voice of a woman reading a financial verdict. "You told me to look under the foundation. You thought you were so incredibly clever. You thought you had engineered the perfect failsafe just in case your greedy brother decided to turn on you. You assumed I would find your little fireproof lockbox, look at the offshore ledgers, and quietly accept my fate. You thought I would be so overwhelmed by the sheer brilliance of your fake death that I would just hand the house over to Thomas and disappear into poverty. You underestimated me, Robert. You mistook my 20 years of loyalty for stupidity." Robert finally found his voice. It was a weak, trembling whisper. "Sarah, how did you find us?" "I did not come here to answer your pathetic questions," I replied, stepping closer to the coffee table. "I came here to explain exactly what is going to happen to you. You see, Robert, your entire plan relied on the assumption that I was just a naive, aging housewife who forgot how to read a balance sheet. But you forgot that before I spent a decade washing your clothes and taking care of your dying mother, I was a senior commercial appraiser. I spent my entire career hunting down hidden assets and destroying fraudulent ledgers. The moment I found your burner phone, the moment I read your sickening text messages calling me a dumb old woman, the grieving widow died." I pointed to the emergency injunction sitting on the table. "You thought Thomas was going to wire you $3 million once the insurance cleared. You thought you were going to sit in this luxury cabin, drink your champagne, and live happily ever after with your stolen fortune. But Thomas is a vulture, Robert. While you were hiding in the woods, I walked right into Thomas's office. I sat in his guest chair and pretended to weep over losing my home. I handed him a deliberately flawed quitclaim deed to keep him distracted. And while he turned his back, I plugged a covert extraction drive directly into his computer. I downloaded his entire network history. I pulled every single one of his private emails and offshore routing logs. Robert's face contorted in confusion and growing panic. He looked at Ashley, then back at me. "What are you talking about? Thomas is handling the money. He is sending the wire tomorrow." "There is no wire, Robert," I said, allowing a cold razor-sharp smile to finally touch my lips. "There was never going to be a wire. Thomas has absolutely no intention of sending you a single dime." I read his internal processing logs. He scheduled the entire $5 million payout to be immediately converted into untraceable cryptocurrency through a decentralized exchange in Eastern Europe. He specifically instructed his broker to wipe the receiving shell company clean and block any incoming communications from this exact IP address. He was going to wash the money, scatter it across dozens of anonymous digital wallets, and leave you here to rot. You are a legally dead man, Robert. You have no identification. You have no legal standing. You have no way to report him to the authorities without confessing to massive insurance fraud and spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Thomas knew that. He knew you were entirely powerless, so he decided to take everything for himself and leave you completely stranded in the snow. Robert staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His knees hit the edge of the leather sofa, and he collapsed onto the cushions. He gripped his hair with both hands, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the absolute reality of his brother's betrayal crashed down upon him. He had sacrificed his marriage, his identity, and his entire life for a fortune that was never going to arrive. "But do not worry, Robert," I continued, my voice echoing clearly through the vaulted cabin. "Thomas is not going to get the money either, because yesterday afternoon, I took all the evidence of your little conspiracy to Gregory Hale. You remember Gregory, do you not? Your old business partner. The man you and Thomas ruthlessly pushed out of the company 15 years ago. Gregory is a retired federal prosecutor now, and he was absolutely thrilled to hear from me. We filed an emergency injunction for suspicion of fraud directly with the State Insurance Commission. The entire $5 million payout is frozen indefinitely behind a federal compliance wall. Thomas cannot touch it. You cannot touch it. The money is gone." I paused, letting the silence amplify the devastation in the room. and just to make sure Thomas pays for trying to extort my house from me, Gregory and I filed a quiet title action on the property. The moment Thomas tries to record that fake deed I gave him, he will trigger a federal flag for wire fraud and felony extortion. I have completely paralyzed both of you. You have absolutely nothing left. Suddenly, the young woman standing near the fireplace decided to insert herself into the conversation. Ashley stepped forward, her face flushed with a mixture of panic and desperate indignation. She had been completely silent, watching her luxury fantasy evaporate into thin air, and now her survival instincts were kicking in. "Listen to me, you crazy old woman," Ashley snapped, trying to project a tough, intimidating facade. Her voice was shrill and grating, entirely lacking any real authority. "You cannot just barge in here and threaten us. We own this cabin. We have rights. You are just jealous because Robert chose me, because he wanted a real woman, not some tired, bitter housewife who forgot how to take care of herself. You need to get out of our house right now before I call the police." I slowly turned my head and shifted my gaze to Ashley. I looked her up and down, taking in her expensive designer winter clothes, her flawless hair, and her arrogant, terrified eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not lose my temper. I looked at her the way a scientist looks at a particularly uninteresting specimen under a microscope. "You are going to call the police?" I asked, my tone dripping with absolute freezing contempt. "Please, Ashley, go right ahead. Pick up the phone. Dial the numbers. I would absolutely love to watch you explain to the local sheriff how you purchased a multi-million-dollar property using a private trust funded entirely by embezzled corporate money. I would love to hear you explain to a federal judge how you knowingly harbored a fugitive who faked his own death to defraud an insurance company. You think you are a mastermind because you convinced a pathetic middle-aged man to buy you expensive things. You think you won a prize." I took a slow step toward her. She instinctively shrank back, her fake bravado crumbling under the weight of my absolute certainty. "Let me explain exactly who you are, Ashley." I said, my words slicing through the room like surgical steel. "You are a 28-year-old fitness instructor who realized she did not want to actually work for a living. You saw an aging, insecure man with a fragile ego, and you realized you could flatter him into funding your luxury lifestyle. You thought you were so sophisticated, trading text messages about ski resorts and laughing at the dumb old wife back in Chicago. You thought you were stepping into a life of endless champagne and private jets, but you did not build anything. You simply attached yourself to a parasite, and now you are going down with the ship." I pointed to the frozen landscape visible through the massive glass windows. "Look around you, Ashley. Look at this beautiful cabin. Look at those designer clothes you are wearing. None of it belongs to you. Every single thing you have is built on stolen money, and the federal government is going to seize all of it. They will freeze your bank accounts. They will confiscate this property. You will be dragged into federal court as a co-conspirator to massive insurance fraud. You traded your entire future for a few months of stolen luxury with a man who does not even have a valid driver's license anymore. When the feds are done with you, you will not be teaching Pilates in a high-end boutique studio. You will be sitting in a federal holding cell wondering how you managed to ruin your life before you even turned 30. Ashley stared at me, her mouth trembling. The color completely drained from her perfect youthful face. She looked at Robert, waiting for him to defend her, waiting for him to tell her that I was lying, that he had a backup plan to save them both. But Robert just sat on the sofa, staring blankly at the floor, totally defeated, absolutely crushed under the weight of his own monumental stupidity. He had nothing to say because he knew every single word I said was the absolute truth. I turned my back on Ashley and looked down at my husband one last time. He looked incredibly small. The arrogant, powerful man who had effortlessly lied to my face for years was completely gone. He was just a pathetic hollow shell trapped in a prison of his own making. "You wanted to be dead, Robert," I said softly, the finality of my words hanging heavily in the cold air. "Well, congratulations. You got your wish. You have no money. You have no identity. You have no brother to save you. And you certainly have no wife. You are a ghost haunting a cabin that is about to be seized by the federal government. You can stay here and wait for the authorities to kick down the door, or you can run into the snow and freeze. I honestly do not care what you do." I reached down and picked up the empty black folder from the coffee table, leaving the damning documents scattered across the wood for them to stare at. I turned and walked toward the splintered front door. I did not look back. I did not need to see their faces to know that I had left them in a state of total, inescapable despair. I stepped out onto the wooden deck and walked down the stairs, the freezing mountain wind hitting my face once again. But this time the cold felt incredibly refreshing. It felt like absolute freedom. I trudged back through the deep snow, following my own footprints toward the hidden SUV. The mission was accomplished. The illusion was completely shattered. I climbed into the heavy vehicle, started the engine, and turned the heater on high. As I drove back down the treacherous mountain road toward the airport, leaving Robert and his mistress to face the terrifying consequences of their greed. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was 55 years old. I had survived the ultimate betrayal. I had reclaimed my power, protected my home, and delivered absolute flawless justice. And as the dark silhouette of the mountain faded into the distance behind me, I realized that my life was not over. It was finally just beginning. The silence in the massive timber cabin was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a devastating explosion. Ashley had completely retreated into the corner of the living room. Her face was pale, and her eyes were darting back and forth between me and the man she thought was her golden ticket. I stood perfectly still by the mahogany coffee table. I let the reality of my words sink deep into the marrow of their bones. But Robert was a man who had spent his entire life talking his way out of corners. He was a salesman. He dealt in illusions. I watched as the sheer terror on his face began to slowly morph into something else. It was the frantic, desperate calculation of a cornered rat. He forced a pathetic, nervous chuckle. The sound was weak and entirely devoid of his usual commanding presence. He slowly pushed himself off the edge of the leather sofa and took a hesitant step toward me. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, as if he were trying to calm down a hysterical child. "Sarah, listen to me," Robert said. His voice was dripping with that familiar, sickeningly sweet manipulation I had endured for 2 decades. "I know you are angry. You have every right to be angry. I made a terrible mistake. I was stressed. The company was drowning in debt, and I panicked. I thought staging the accident was the only way to save you from financial ruin. I did it for us." I did not blink. I did not move a single muscle. I just stared at him, allowing the absolute emptiness in my eyes to reflect his own pathetic lies back at him. He took another step closer. His eyes flickered down to the documents scattered across the table and then back up to my face. "Look, you are obviously incredibly smart," he continued, his tone shifting into a smooth conspiratorial whisper. "You figured it all out. You beat me at my own game. I respect that. I really do, but let us be rational adults about this. The insurance company is paying out $5 million. That is a massive amount of money, Sarah. There is no need for us to destroy each other over this. We can fix it. We can be partners again." I tilted my head slightly. "Partners?" "Yes, partners," Robert said, his voice gaining a fraction of its old arrogant confidence. He actually believed he was winning me over. He thought the mention of money would instantly erase the betrayal. "Thomas is wiring the $3 million to my offshore account tomorrow morning. When that money clears, we can split it. I will give you half, $1.5 million in clean, untraceable cash. You can take the money, go back to Chicago, and live whatever life you want. You will never have to worry about anything ever again. We can just walk away from this and pretend none of it ever happened. $1.5 million, Sarah. Just think about it." I let his words hang in the freezing air of the cabin. I looked at the man I had vowed to love and protect. He was offering me a cut of a fraudulent insurance payout based on his own staged death, while his 28-year-old mistress stood shivering in the corner. The sheer audacity of his proposal was almost fascinating. I reached down and picked up the printed network logs I had extracted from his brother's computer. I held the pages loosely in my gloved hand. "You are offering me $1.5 million, I asked, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any inflection. "Yes," Robert nodded eagerly. He took another step forward, extending his hand toward me as if to seal a business deal. "Half of the entire cut. It is a win for both of us." I let out a soft, chilling laugh. The sound echoed off the vaulted wooden ceilings. I shook my head slowly. "Robert, you really are the most arrogant fool I have ever met. You still think you are the smartest person in the room. You still think you are holding the winning hand." I took a step toward him. I did not raise my voice, but every single word I spoke hit him like a physical strike. "There is no $3 million, Robert," I said, staring directly into his panicked eyes. There is no wire transfer coming tomorrow morning. There is no offshore account waiting to be funded. You are offering me half of absolutely nothing." Robert froze. The forced smile vanished from his face. "What are you talking about?" I held up the printed network logs and shoved them directly against his chest. "I told you I went into Thomas' office. I told you I downloaded his entire digital architecture. Do you really think I just looked at the insurance policy and walked away? I read every single one of his private emails. I read his communication with his offshore broker. Thomas never had any intention of sending you a single dime." Robert grabbed the papers from my hand. His eyes scanned the dense columns of code and text. I watched his pupils dilate in pure, unfiltered terror as he began to comprehend the digital trail. "Let me spell it out for you, since you obviously never bothered to check your brother's math." I continued, my voice slicing through the silent cabin. Thomas filed the insurance claim as the shadow owner of Apex Holdings. He set the routing protocol to receive the $5 million. But instead of establishing a secondary transfer to your Cayman account, he contracted a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange in Eastern Europe. He ordered the broker to immediately convert the entire $5 million into digital coins the second the funds cleared. He ordered them to wash the money through dozens of anonymous wallets that only he controls. No, Robert gasped. His hands were shaking so violently the papers rattled. "No, Thomas would never do that. We had a deal. We are brothers." "He's a vulture," I replied coldly. "And you handed him a mountain of free meat. Look at the last page of that stack, Robert. Look at the email he sent to the broker in Cyprus." Robert flipped frantically to the last page. He read the text out loud, his voice barely above a broken whisper. "Wipe the receiving account completely clean. Block all incoming communications from the Montana location." "He blocked you, Robert," I said, driving the final nail into his coffin. "You are officially a dead man. You have no legal identity. You have no passport. You cannot walk into a bank. You cannot call the police. You cannot sue him. You handed him $5 million and a flawless cover story. He took the money and he left you here in the snow to rot. You are completely and utterly penniless." The papers slipped from Robert's hands and scattered across the beautiful Persian rug. He backed away from me, his hands clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. He stumbled backward until his back hit the cold stone of the fireplace. He slid down the wall and collapsed onto the hearth. He pulled his knees to his chest and stared at the floor. The great mastermind was completely broken. He had traded his wife, his career, and his life for a grand illusion, and his own brother had stolen the illusion right out from under him. At that exact moment, a sharp, frantic movement caught my eye. Ashley had stepped out of the corner. The terrified, silent mistress was completely gone. She was staring at Robert with a look of absolute visceral disgust. The realization had just hit her perfectly manicured brain. She was not standing in a luxury cabin with a wealthy, powerful man. She was standing in the middle of nowhere with a broke, wanted fugitive who could not even afford to buy her a cup of coffee. "You are broke!" Ashley shrieked. Her voice was incredibly loud, shattering the heavy silence of the room. "You told me we were going to have $3 million. You told me we were going to travel to Europe and buy a house in Switzerland. You told me you had everything perfectly planned out." Robert looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "Ashley, please, we can fix this. I can call Thomas. I can threaten him. I know things about his logistics business. I can make him pay us." "Threaten him with what, Ashley?" screamed, kicking the shattered pieces of the champagne glass across the floor. "You are legally dead, you absolute idiot. You cannot do anything. I gave up my apartment in the city for this. I quit my job at the studio. I risked going to federal prison because you promised me a fortune. And now you have nothing. You are worse than nothing, Ashley." "Please," Robert begged, holding his hands out to her. "I love you. We can start over." Ashley let out a harsh, venomous laugh. "Start over with what? You do not even exist. You think I actually wanted to live in the woods with a pathetic, middle-aged man who complains about his back pain every morning. I wanted the money, Robert. And since there is no money, there is absolutely no reason for me to stay here and go down with your sinking ship." She turned on her heel and sprinted toward the master bedroom. I watched her go, feeling a dark, immense satisfaction. She was a rat, fleeing a burning building. I could hear the frantic sounds of drawers being yanked open and clothes being violently stuffed into designer luggage. She was abandoning him just as ruthlessly as he had abandoned me. Robert sat on the stone hearth, weeping. The sound was pathetic. It was the sound of a man who realized he had destroyed his entire universe for absolutely nothing. He looked up at me, his face covered in tears and snot. "Sarah, please," he whimpered. "You have to help me. I am your husband. We were married for 20 years. You cannot just leave me here like this. Thomas took everything. I have nowhere to go. Please take me back to Chicago with you. We can go to the police together. We can tell them Thomas forced me to do it. We can make a deal." I looked down at him. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I only felt the cold, clean air of absolute closure. "I am not taking you anywhere, Robert," I said, my voice perfectly steady and resolute. "And you do not need to worry about going to the police, because Gregory and I already brought the police to you." Robert stopped crying. He stared at me, his eyes widening in total, incomprehensible horror. "What do you mean?" I turned my back to him and walked slowly toward the massive wall of floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I looked out into the freezing Montana night. The snow was still falling heavily, coating the pine trees in a thick blanket of white. The driveway was completely dark and silent. "Did you really think I flew all the way out here just to gloat?" I asked, speaking to his reflection in the dark glass. "Did you really think a retired federal prosecutor like Gregory Hale would just file an injunction and go to sleep? Gregory hates you, Robert. He hates Thomas. The moment we traced the location of this cabin from your stupid girlfriend's photographs. Gregory called his old contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He handed them the offshore ledgers, the forged insurance policy, and the exact coordinates of this property. We handed them a multi-million-dollar wire fraud and insurance extortion case wrapped in a perfect bow. I took a single step to the side, moving away from the center of the window. I looked out into the darkness of the tree line. Through the heavy falling snow, a sudden flash of light pierced the gloom. Then another, and another. The silent winter landscape was suddenly illuminated by the violent, chaotic flashing of red and blue lights. They reflected off the snow, creating a blinding, terrifying strobe effect across the entire property. The heavy crunch of specialized tactical vehicles pulling into the unpaved driveway echoed through the glass. They had parked at the bottom of the hill and approached silently, just as I had done. But now, the element of surprise was over. The flashing lights painted the interior of the cabin in harsh, alternating colors of crimson and sapphire. Robert scrambled to his feet, pressing his hands against the glass. He stared at the fleet of federal vehicles surrounding the cabin. Dozens of armed agents were pouring out of the trucks, wearing heavy tactical gear and dark windbreakers with bright yellow letters printed across their backs. The reality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. There was no escape. There was no negotiation. There was only the absolute certainty of a federal prison cell. In the background, I heard the heavy master bedroom door swing open. Ashley dragged 2 massive suitcases out into the hallway. She stopped dead in her tracks the moment she saw the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the living room. She dropped the handles of her luggage. Her designer bags hit the floor with a heavy thud. She clamped her hands over her mouth, letting out a muffled, terrified scream. The gold digger had packed her bags, but she had nowhere left to run. The perimeter was completely secured. A loud, booming voice echoed through a megaphone outside, slicing through the howling mountain wind. "Robert Jenkins, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The property is completely surrounded. Step away from the glass, open the front door, and walk outside with your hands empty and visible. Do it now." Robert turned to look at me. He was completely broken. His shoulders slumped, and his hands fell limply to his sides. He looked like a hollow ghost waiting to be erased from the world. "You destroyed me," he whispered, his voice trembling with ultimate defeat. I pulled the collar of my thermal coat tighter around my neck. I looked at the man who had traded 20 years of my loyalty for a fake death and a cheap illusion. "No, Robert," I said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as the Montana snow. "You destroyed yourself. I just delivered the receipt." I turned and walked toward the splintered front door, leaving my dead husband to face the federal agents waiting for him in the freezing dark. I stepped out onto the snowy deck, holding my hands up clearly into the flashing lights. An agent approached me, lowering his weapon as I calmly identified myself as the informant. I was escorted toward a warm waiting vehicle. I did not look back at the cabin. The war was completely over. The villains had built their own perfect graves, and I had simply locked them inside. Women can sacrifice their entire lives for the people they love, but we should never be mistaken for foolish. When you back a loyal woman into a corner, when you underestimate her intelligence and betray her trust, you will quickly learn the devastating extent of her true strength. Karma never misses an address. It simply waits for the perfect moment to arrive. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it, where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below. The federal agents moved with terrifying and synchronized precision out in the freezing darkness of the Montana wilderness. They did not bother to knock on the heavy oak frame of the front door. They did not wait for Robert to realize that his luxurious fantasy had come to a violent end. A massive, tactical ram wielded by two heavily armored officers shattered the reinforced locking mechanism in a single brutal strike. The sound of splintering wood exploded through the quiet cabin, sending shards of expensive timber flying across the pristine Persian rugs. The biting, freezing mountain wind rushed into the luxury hideout, instantly overwhelming the warmth of the roaring stone fireplace. Dozens of men and women wearing heavy dark windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, poured into the expansive living room. They moved with absolute and uncompromising authority, their heavy tactical boots trampling directly over the shattered remains of Robert's crystal champagne glass. The blinding red and blue emergency lights from the massive fleet of vehicles parked outside washed over the interior walls, painting the beautiful vaulted ceilings in violent flashing colors. Robert did not try to run. He did not have the physical strength or the courage to even attempt a desperate escape into the snow. He stood completely frozen by the stone hearth, his face pale and sickly in the alternating flashes of police lights. The arrogant mastermind, who had spent months orchestrating his own death, was suddenly reduced to a trembling, pathetic shell of a human being. An agent stepped forward, grabbed Robert by the shoulder of his expensive dark cashmere sweater, and slammed him roughly against the smooth stone of the fireplace. Robert let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp as the breath was forcefully knocked out of his lungs. He offered absolutely no physical resistance as the federal agent wrenched his arms aggressively behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed clearly through the cabin. It was the most beautiful, deeply satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the unmistakable sound of absolute justice snapping shut. Robert twisted his neck awkwardly, his terrified eyes darting frantically around the room until they finally locked onto my face. I was standing safely on the wooden deck, protected by a perimeter of armed federal agents, quietly watching his entire world collapse into absolute dust. The man who had typed those sickening text messages calling me a dumb and aging housewife was now weeping uncontrollably. Thick tears streamed down his face, freezing against his cheeks in the biting mountain air. "Sarah, please!" Robert screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "You have to tell them to stop. You have to tell them this is a mistake. I am your husband. We built a whole life together in Chicago. You cannot just stand there and let them take me away to prison. I will do anything you want. I will give you everything. Please, Sarah, I am begging you to help me." I looked at him standing there in the flashing lights. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I felt nothing but the clean, cold clarity of a woman who had successfully excised a highly toxic tumor from her life. "You have absolutely nothing left to give me, Robert," I said, my voice carrying clearly and steadily over the howling winter wind. "You are a legally dead man who committed massive federal wire fraud and insurance extortion. You deliberately traded your freedom for a fake grave and a cheap illusion. I am not your wife anymore. I am simply the financial witness who handed your entire criminal enterprise over to the federal government." Inside the hallway, the sound of shrill, hysterical screaming suddenly erupted. Two female agents dragged Ashley Brooks out of the master bedroom. She was no longer wearing her perfectly styled athletic gear or posing for social media photographs. She was desperately clutching a thick designer winter coat, her long blonde hair tangled and messy across her face. Her two massive luxury suitcases sat completely abandoned on the floor behind her, their contents spilling out onto the hardwood. She fought wildly against the agents, kicking her expensive winter boots against the floorboards, completely unable to process the fact that her glamorous fantasy was permanently over. "Get your hands off of me," Ashley shrieked at the top of her lungs, her heavy tears ruining her flawless makeup. I did not do anything wrong. I am just a victim in all of this. He lied to me. He told me he was a wealthy logistics broker with millions of dollars. I had absolutely no idea the money was stolen from his company. You cannot arrest me for his crimes. I demand to call my lawyer right now. The lead federal investigator stepped directly in front of her, completely unimpressed by her frantic and entitled display of privilege. You are not a victim, Miss Brooks, the agent said, his voice hard and utterly uncompromising. We have the complete digital transcripts from the encrypted burner phone. We have the banking logs proving you knowingly purchased this property using a private trust funded entirely by embezzled corporate money. You actively conspired to harbor a wanted fugitive, and you attempted to conceal the proceeds of a $5 million insurance fraud. You are being charged today as a primary accomplice to federal wire fraud and money laundering. You are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The blood completely drained from Ashley's face. Her shrill screaming stopped, instantly replaced by a hollow, breathless silence. The brutal reality of her situation finally penetrated her profound arrogance. She was not going to be traveling to Europe. She was not going to be skiing in the Swiss Alps. She was totally destitute. Her personal bank accounts were already frozen by federal order. Her reputation in the high-end fitness world was completely and permanently destroyed. She was going to trade her designer leggings for a bright orange jumpsuit, and she would spend the best years of her youth locked inside a concrete cell. She looked over at Robert with a gaze filled with absolute venomous hatred, realizing that the man she thought was her golden ticket had actually purchased her a one-way trip to a federal prison. While the agents secured the cabin in Montana, my cell phone vibrated deeply in my heavy coat pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Gregory Hale back in Chicago. The message contained only 2 words: mission accomplished. I closed my eyes and allowed a deep, triumphant breath to fill my lungs. I could picture the scene in Chicago perfectly. At the exact moment the tactical team breached the cabin in Whitefish, a synchronized raid had taken place at the glass-fronted headquarters of Jenkins Logistics. Gregory had personally guided the federal task force into the building to execute the warrants. Thomas had probably been sitting in his dark mahogany office, frantically refreshing his offshore bank accounts, completely terrified by the sudden realization that the $5 million wire transfer was permanently blocked. He had likely been screaming at his computer monitor when the heavy executive doors were violently kicked open. I could imagine the look on the face of the rude, condescending receptionist as dozens of armed agents swarmed the corporate lobby. Thomas, the arrogant corporate shark who loved to threaten and belittle grieving widows, was violently dragged out from behind his massive desk. He was paraded through the center of his own company in handcuffs, totally humiliated in front of his entire administrative staff. Thomas thought he was untouchable. He thought his Delaware shell companies and his offshore cryptocurrency washers made him a ghost. But he had walked blindly into the quiet title trap Gregory and I had so carefully set. By attempting to seize the deed to my home, using fabricated corporate debt as leverage, Thomas had committed textbook felony extortion across state lines. The federal authorities had seized his entire company. The logistics firm he had stolen from Gregory 15 years ago was now the property of the United States government. Thomas was bankrupt, permanently disgraced, and facing decades behind bars for orchestrating the massive insurance fraud and attempting to steal my home. His entire empire had collapsed into rubble in a single morning. I opened my eyes and looked back at the chaotic scene unfolding in the snow. The federal agents were marching Robert and Ashley out the front door and down the wooden stairs of the deck. The biting wind whipped fiercely across Robert's face as he stumbled heavily through the freezing snow. He looked completely pathetic, a hollow shell of a man entirely stripped of his power, his money, and his fake identity. He faced 20 long years in a maximum security facility for his crimes. 20 years of staring at concrete walls completely erased from the world he tried so desperately to manipulate. As the agents pushed him toward the back of a heavily armored transport vehicle, Robert turned his head and looked at me one final time. He fell to his knees in the deep snow, fighting against the firm grip of the officers holding his arms. "Sarah, I am so sorry," he wailed, his voice completely raw and broken by the freezing air. "Please, I never meant for it to go this far. I was just so unhappy with my life. Please forgive me for what I did. You're the only one who can help me now." I stood perfectly still on the wooden deck. I looked down at the man who had been my husband for 2 decades, I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent caring for his sick mother. I thought about the career I had happily sacrificed to build his home. I thought about the absolute agony I felt standing in that pawn shop trading my platinum wedding ring just to survive the fake debt he had left behind to ruin me. And looking at him now shivering and weeping in the dirt, I realized that I had already forgiven myself for ever trusting him. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I did not scream at him or demand useless apologies. Silence is the ultimate weapon against a narcissist. I simply turned my back to him, buttoned the top of my thermal winter coat to block out the wind, and began walking away through the knee-deep snow. I heard him screaming my name. The sound echoed through the frozen pine trees, desperate and utterly hopeless. But I did not turn around. I did not look back. His pathetic voice faded into the distance, completely swallowed by the howling mountain wind and the blaring sirens of the federal vehicles. I trudged steadily through the dark forest, following the path back to the small clearing where I had parked my rented sport utility vehicle. My boots crunched loudly against the icy crust of the snow. The freezing temperature bit sharply at my cheeks, but my chest was radiating with a profound, unshakable warmth. I reached the heavy truck, opened the door, and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine and turned the heating system up to the highest level, letting the warm air wash generously over my freezing hands and face. I shifted the vehicle into gear and pulled out of the shadows, merging smoothly onto the winding, treacherous mountain road. I drove back down toward the flatlands, leaving the flashing red and blue lights far behind me in the darkness. I was 55 years old. I had survived the ultimate betrayal. I had systematically dismantled a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy, and I had reclaimed my absolute power and independence. As the dark silhouette of the mountain faded slowly in the rearview mirror, I looked out at the open road ahead. My life was finally truly my own, and it was going to be magnificent. Women can sacrifice their entire lives for the people they love, but we should never be mistaken for foolish. When you back a loyal woman into a corner, when you underestimate her intelligence and betray her trust, you will quickly learn the devastating extent of her true strength. Karma never misses an address. It simply waits for the perfect moment to arrive. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below. 6 months later, the brilliant morning sun reflected off the gleaming waters of Lake Michigan, casting a warm golden glow across the polished hardwood floors of my brand new corner office. I stood by the expansive glass window holding a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. I inhaled the rich, bitter aroma and allowed a deep feeling of absolute peace to wash over my entire body. I looked out at the bustling city of Chicago far below me. The tiny cars and busy pedestrians moved in a frantic rhythm, completely unaware of the tremendous personal victory I had achieved. I turned around and looked at the heavy frosted glass door of my suite. The bold, elegant gold lettering proudly displayed my maiden name. Sarah Miller, commercial real estate appraiser. I had dropped Robert's last name the very second the judge finalized the paperwork. I was no longer the invisible aging housewife who spent her days washing clothes and pureeing soup for an ungrateful family. I was the founder and chief executive officer of my own highly successful firm, and I had built this entire empire on the ashes of my treacherous husband's grand illusion. The past 6 months had been an absolute whirlwind of legal retribution and financial reclamation. Once the federal agents raided the luxury cabin in Montana and dragged Robert out into the freezing snow, the entire criminal conspiracy imploded with spectacular speed. Robert and his brother Thomas immediately turned on each other like starving wolves. In the federal holding cells, they blamed one another for the massive insurance fraud and the money laundering scheme. Their desperate attempts to save themselves only provided the prosecutors with a mountain of undeniable evidence. But while the federal government was busy dismantling their freedom, I was in civil court ruthlessly dismantling their remaining wealth. I did not shed a single tear in that courtroom. I sat with perfect posture, projecting an aura of cold, unyielding authority as my legal team presented the stolen offshore ledgers, the forged insurance policies, and the fake death certificate. The judge was absolutely appalled by the sheer magnitude of their cruelty. I sued them for every single ounce of emotional distress, financial manipulation, and attempted extortion. The civil court victory was devastatingly absolute, because Thomas had illegally attempted to seize the deed to my home using fabricated corporate debt as leverage. The judge awarded me massive punitive damages. Every single hidden asset, every offshore account, and every dirty cryptocurrency wallet Thomas had tried to conceal was frozen, seized, and liquidated to pay my restitution. The massive wealth they had tried to steal from the insurance company was confiscated by the federal authorities, but their personal fortunes were handed directly to me. I walked out of that courthouse a very wealthy woman. I used the funds to officially open my own commercial appraisal firm, renting the most prestigious office space in the financial district. Clients flocked to me almost immediately, recognizing the sharp, brilliant mind of a woman who had successfully outsmarted two of the most cunning corporate criminals in the city. The woman who had wept in a dirty pawnshop trading her platinum wedding ring just to survive the week was a distant memory. I had bought that ring back, melted it down, and sold the gold. And then there was the colonial house, the 4-bedroom property that had been my prison of domestic servitude for 2 decades. The house where Robert had hidden his fireproof lockbox beneath the basement foundation. I did not sell it. I refused to let their dark energy force me out of the home I had maintained with my own 2 hands. Instead, I reclaimed it completely. I hired a team of contractors to rip out every single trace of Robert. We tore up the carpets, we knocked down walls, we dragged that massive antique oak wardrobe out of the master bedroom and smashed it into pieces before throwing it into a dumpster. I painted the walls in bright, vibrant colors. I turned the dark, terrifying basement into a beautiful modern home gym. I replaced the heavy, suffocating furniture with sleek, elegant pieces that reflected my own personal taste. I erased Robert from my life so thoroughly that it felt as though he had never existed at all. As for the young high-end fitness instructor who thought she had secured a golden ticket to a life of luxury, her spectacular downfall was almost poetic. Ashley Brooks lost absolutely everything. When the federal agents raided the Montana cabin, they seized her designer luggage, her expensive winter gear, and the property itself, since it had been purchased with embezzled corporate funds. She was dragged back to Chicago in handcuffs and publicly charged as a primary accomplice to wire fraud and money laundering. Her reputation in the boutique fitness world was permanently destroyed. Her wealthy clients abandoned her immediately, horrified by the scandal. She tried to plead ignorance, claiming she was just a naive victim manipulated by an older man, but the text messages on the burner phone proved she was a willing, greedy participant. She was left entirely destitute, facing years of probation and an insurmountable mountain of legal fees. She learned the very hard way that a lifestyle built on stolen money and shattered marriages is nothing but a temporary illusion. A soft knock on my office door pulled me from my deeply satisfying reflections. The heavy frosted glass door swung open, and Gregory Hale walked into the room. He looked as sharp and commanding as ever, wearing an impeccable charcoal-tailored suit. His gray hair was perfectly combed, and his sharp, perceptive eyes crinkled at the corners as he offered me a warm, genuine smile. He was carrying 2 large paper cups of premium dark roast coffee from the artisanal cafe down the street. Gregory and I had spent the last 6 months fighting side by side in the legal trenches. He had utilized his brilliant legal mind and his extensive federal connections to ensure that Robert and Thomas faced the absolute maximum penalties for their crimes. In the process, our alliance had blossomed into something incredibly profound. We had started as 2 deeply betrayed individuals seeking justice, but we had slowly become trusted partners, equals who respected each other's strength and resilience. "Good morning, Sarah Gregory," said his deep baritone voice filling the bright office. He walked over to my large modern desk and handed me one of the coffee cups. "I brought you your usual dark roast black with absolutely no sugar. Exactly the way you like it." I took the cup, feeling the comforting heat radiate through the cardboard sleeve. "Thank you, Gregory. You always know exactly what I need." I replied, my voice reflecting the deep, peaceful affection I felt for this man. He sat down in the luxurious leather guest chair opposite my desk, crossing his legs comfortably. He looked around the pristine office, taking in the panoramic views of the city skyline and the sleek professional decor. You have built something truly magnificent here, Sarah. Every time I walk into this building, I am absolutely astounded by your success. You took a terrible nightmare and turned it into an empire. I smiled, taking a slow sip of the rich, bitter coffee. I did not do it alone. Gregory, your legal expertise was the hammer that shattered their glass house. Gregory nodded slowly, his expression turning serious but deeply satisfied. Speaking of shattered glass houses, I received a call from my old colleagues at the federal prosecutor's office this morning. The sentencing hearings concluded late yesterday afternoon. The judge did not show them a single ounce of leniency. Thomas was handed 25 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and extortion. His logistics company has been completely dissolved by the government. He lost every single penny he ever made. I let the words sink in, feeling a tremendous weight lift from my soul. And Robert? I asked, my voice completely steady. Gregory looked directly into my eyes. Robert received 20 years for insurance fraud and conspiracy. He stood in the courtroom and wept like a child. He actually begged the judge to let him call you to apologize one last time. The judge denied the request. Robert is going to spend the next 2 decades sitting in a small concrete cell, completely erased from the world. I leaned back in my leather chair and took another sip of my coffee. I did not feel any anger. I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound, absolute closure. Robert and Thomas had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable objects. They had built their wealth on deception and cruelty. They had severely underestimated the quiet, aging wife who washed their dishes and balanced their petty cash. They thought I was a submissive, weak woman who would easily crumble under the pressure of their fabricated threats. They never expected me to stand up, secure my own weapons, and burn their entire criminal enterprise to the ground. Now they were paying the ultimate price for their profound arrogance, and I was sitting in a sunlit corner office surrounded by the beautiful, successful life I had built for myself. Gregory leaned forward, placing his coffee cup on the edge of my desk. He reached out and gently rested his hand over mine. His touch was warm, solid, and incredibly grounding. It was not the demanding, selfish touch of a man who wanted to control me. It was the respectful, tender touch of a man who truly valued my intellect and my strength. "We make an incredible team, Sarah," he said softly, his perceptive eyes locking onto mine with a quiet promise of future happiness. Whether we are dismantling federal criminals in a courtroom or enjoying a quiet dinner in the city, I have never met a woman who commands my respect the way you do. I looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. A genuine warm smile spread across my lips. "I think this partnership is just beginning, Gregory," I replied softly. "I think we have a lot of beautiful days ahead of us." Later that afternoon, after Gregory had left to attend to his own affairs, I stood by the massive glass window once again. The sun was beginning to set over the vast expanse of Lake Michigan, painting the winter sky in brilliant shades of orange and violet. I placed my hand against the cool, smooth glass and reflected on the incredible journey of the past 6 months. I thought about the terrified, weeping woman I used to be, the woman who stood in that dusty pawn shop shaking with fear, handing over her wedding ring just to buy a few groceries. That woman felt like a stranger to me now. She was a ghost from a past life. I had shed the identity of the submissive, obedient wife like a snake shedding its old skin. I had stepped out of the suffocating shadows of domestic servitude and into the brilliant, radiant light of my true power. I realized that society trains women to be the quiet caretakers. We are conditioned to sacrifice our careers, our dreams, and our own personal happiness to support the men in our lives. We are taught to endure disrespect with a polite smile and to swallow our pain to keep the peace. But there is a dangerous limit to that sacrifice. When a woman is pushed to the absolute brink, when she discovers that her loyalty has been rewarded with vicious betrayal and calculated cruelty, a sleeping dragon awakens inside her. The greed and the arrogance of men like Robert and Thomas blinded them to the very real danger they were courting. They thought they could manipulate the universe without consequence. But the universe has a perfect memory. Karma never misses an address. It does not matter how deeply you bury your lies or how cleverly you construct your illusions. The truth always finds a way to surface, and the wicked will always be destroyed by the very traps they set for others. My life is now a testament to that undeniable truth. I lost a husband who never truly loved me, but I gained an entire empire of self-respect and financial independence. I lost the illusion of a happy marriage, but I found a genuine, authentic partnership with a man who celebrates my strength instead of fearing it. Every single morning, I wake up in a beautiful home that belongs entirely to me. Every single day, I walk into an office that I built from the ground up. I am surrounded by success, by peace, and by the quiet, thrilling knowledge that I am the sole architect of my own magnificent destiny. The storm came to destroy me, but it only succeeded in washing away the dirt and revealing the solid, unbreakable foundation underneath. Women can sacrifice, but we should never be foolish. When backed into a corner, show them your true strength. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below.